Baruch was silent for a long moment, its chelicerae opening and closing several times without making a sound. Its 8 legs bent slightly, and its center of gravity lowered, as if it were replaying or struggling to make sense of the strange sensation it had just felt. It emitted a series of low, slow clicks, full of uncertainty. Strange, when the light shone over, my brain suddenly buzzed. Baruch's voice was harsher than Aragog's, but it still carried that rasping, friction-like quality common to spiders. Then I felt, why were the others moving so slowly, so stupid? Father Aragog was like that? I can do better. I am stronger than all of them. The more it spoke, the more unsettled it became. Its chelicerae rubbed against each other anxiously, and its front legs tapped aimlessly on the ground. Click, click, click. But that wasn't my thought. I know it wasn't, but it was there at the time. It felt real. I can do better. I am stronger than all of them. I should be the leader, it insisted. Aragog's massive head turned toward Regulus, its 8 eyes reflecting shock and bewilderment along with a deeper, heavier concern. It did not understand the device, nor why a beam of light could make its cleverest offspring suddenly convinced of its superiority. But it could tell that Baruch should not be like this. Had the young wizard tampered with the spider's mind? Regulus ignored Aragog and asked Baruch, "Do you still have that feeling now?" Baruch shook itself violently. All 8 legs trembled together, the bristles on its carapace rising and falling like a dog shaking off water. "It's gone. It was like a strange dream, and now I'm awake." Regulus nodded with a satisfied look, put away his 12, and stepped forward to pat the thick front leg Baruch had extended. The limb was thicker than his arm, its carapace cold and smooth like a black stone worn by the sea. "Thank you," he said. Baruch lowered its head so Regulus could reach its back. The dorsal plate was covered in fine, dense bristles, like a stiff brush. A shallow groove ran down its center from head to abdomen, the carapace in that channel darker than the rest, almost bottomless. Regulus patted it twice. Baruch answered with a brisk, crisp click, short and different from the earlier uncertain sounds. A stray thought crossed Regulus's mind. Can spiders even dream? Is dreaming the privilege of all intelligent beings? What about a bowtruckle? Does that even have a brain? Do they dream too? He watched Aragog for a long time. The more intelligent a spider, the more clearly emotion showed in its eyes. Some around them had cloudy, fogged eyes that revealed nothing. Others were hollow, the cold glare of a predator. Spiders like Baruch, whose eyes showed curiosity, confusion, bewilderment, already signaled very high intelligence. Most of the rest ranged from merely clever to almost purely instinct-driven, their gaze monotonous and listless. Aragog spoke slowly. "Your experiment was a success?" Regulus nodded. "It was. It was a preliminary success, weaker than he'd hoped." The surge of arrogance lasted only 10 seconds and was only enough for Baruch to posture before its peers, not long enough to truly warp its judgment. The duration was too short, the effect too shallow. It needed refinement. But the direction was clear. The light needed to be more focused, aimed directly at the central pair of compound eyes. The emotional sample needed to be purer. Arrogance had been contaminated with contempt and disdain. The transmission had to be more efficient. 3 seconds was far too long for a fight. Baruch's feedback proved the underlying logic. Light could carry emotion, emotion could influence judgment, and the brain could mistake outside thoughts for its own. The current version, however, was nowhere near usable on humans. He would have to return, often. Baruch clicked again, the tone just lifting. Regulus heard a hint of joy. The spider was pleased, briefly buzzing with the false certainty it could lead. He looked at Aragog. "You said it. I owe you one. You can ask for it now, or think it over and tell me later." Aragog considered, its compound eyes flickering. The topmost pair of large eyes were half open. The middle pairs rotated rapidly. The bottommost pair stared motionless at Regulus. "Another time," it said. Regulus inclined his head. A debt remained a debt. But he also had to be sure of silence. He couldn't risk the spiders ever talking about his visit or the Levin device. He didn't fear deliberate betrayal. Aragog had no reason to lie, but Hagrid would ask. Hagrid visited with food and news and could coax truths from Aragog that the spider would not conceal. That gap had to be sealed. "As for the explanation you wanted," Regulus said, "why I felt I could do this." Aragog shook its head. all 8 eyes fixed on him. Regulus said nothing more. Then, without a word, thin orange-red flames surged over his skin, running along his arms, coiling over his shoulders, dancing on his fingertips. Every flicker was constrained by his will, none spread. He kept the temperature low, but the air in the nest still heated. The silk shivered in the heat wave, edges curling but not burning. Aragog recoiled violently. Its 8 legs kicked back, the claws gouging deep furrows in the velvet earth. Its bulk slammed into several spider silk pillars behind it, shaking the nest. Dew on the webs drifted free and steamed into mist in the hot air. The fine bristles along its body curled and gave off a bitter, singed smell. Fire, the thing Acromantulas feared most. It may not have known the name Fiendfire, but it recognized the primitive terror that rose from ancestral memory faster than reason and seized the body. Legs shook, chelicerae trembled, even breathing grew ragged. Yet it did not flee. Intelligence held instinct in check. Mainly because it could see the young wizard wrapped in flames had not even scorched a single strand of silk under his feet. The silk at Regulus's feet lay uncurled, untouched, as if the flames had nothing to do with them. The smaller spiders scattered, many in panic colliding and rolling into tangled balls of limbs. One banged into a pillar and covered its face with webbing, frantically scraping it away. Mozag retreated to the deepest part of the nest, legs folded, abdomen pressed to the ground, eyes shut tight, chelicerae tucked under her cephalothorax in a posture of surrender. Baruch did not bolt either. It backed a few steps, then steadied itself, legs slightly bent, center of gravity lowered. Its compound eyes fixed on Regulus, not with fear but with an odd, unnameable emotion. For a moment its gaze flicked to Aragog, as if confirming or denying something, and then withdrew. Regulus noticed. Even though the leaven effect had faded, the residue of "I can do better" might still be worming in its thoughts. It had looked at its father as if testing a truth. Regulus let the flames slide back into his body. They vanished in an instant. The nest was left with the acrid smell of scorched bristles and the rattling of silk settling. The hot air lingered. He said nothing more. This was the explanation. There was no "I think I can do this." There was simply "I can do this." Aragog watched the last shimmer go out and stood frozen a beat longer, legs still bent and chelicerae tightly shut. There was no anger left in it now, only fear. Regulus's voice was flat, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "I hope no creature besides spiders learns of my visit here tonight, and the same goes for this 11. There was no explicit threat in the words, but if Aragog failed to understand it, its intelligence would have been wasted. The giant spider's chelicerae opened and closed once. When it spoke, its voice was low and emotionless, as if the fire had burned that away. "It won't," Regulus nodded. Aragog asked cautiously, "And the favor?" Regulus smiled. "You can tell me when you've thought it over. I will be back." Aragog was silent for a long moment before, in a small voice thick with reluctance, asking, "You really won't look for the centaur?" Regulus did not take the bait. He glanced once more at Baruch. "Baruch is not bad," he said. Then he vanished. The nest sank back into its quiet. After a long while, Mozag crept to Aragog's side, moving slowly with legs testing the ground, as if afraid to disturb anything. Her chelicerae touched Aragog's front leg, and she hissed a string of worried, questioning sounds. Aragog gently nudged her, and its compound eyes remained fixed in the direction Regulus had left, the topmost pair open, the middle pairs spinning a little, the lowest pair motionless. Baruch clicked and clacked nearby, soft and intermittent, like someone replaying a moment to itself. Its front legs tapped in a chaotic rhythm, click, click, click. Aragog glanced at it, then settled slowly onto the velvet mat, closing its largest pair of compound eyes. The forbidden forest fell back into its usual hush, broken only by the distant call of night owls and the ever-present mist that never cleared from the hollow. Chapter 240. Lily, Learn Magic with Me. On the first Thursday of November, the cold Scottish wind slipped through the gaps in the stone walls, and a thin frost formed on the corridor windows. The students had exchanged their lightweight robes for thicker ones, collars pulled up against the chill as they headed to class. Charms was on the 7th floor, with east-facing windows. When the morning light slanted in, dust motes drifted in the golden beams. Regulus took a window seat, unwrapped his scarf, and draped it over the back of the chair. Hermes sat beside him, Avery and Alex behind them. Professor Flitwick stood on a stack of books, smiling as the class settled. He clapped, and the chatter faded. Today, we will learn two new charms, Sonorous and Muffliato. He pressed his wand to his throat. Sonorous. Flitwick normally spoke in a high, soft voice, but now each syllable rang like a bell, making the window panes vibrate and sending a loosely packed book toppling from the highest shelf. Students in the back instinctively covered their ears, then peered around in curiosity. The professor tapped his throat again. Quietus. Sound vanished. Several students leaned forward, straining to hear, but there was nothing, just surprised looks. Regulus watched the professor's Adam's apple still tremble slightly. Sound was being produced, but it wasn't being transmitted. He already knew both charms well enough, basics of the basics, but with many practical applications. Dumbledore used Sonorous every year when addressing the Great Hall. It was simple. Press the wand to the throat, say the incantation, and the voice amplified. Say Quietus, and the amplification stopped. No flair required, no special emotion, just the correct gesture and word. A thought drifted through his mind. Sound is a wave, so is light. They're not the same. Sound is a mechanical wave needing a medium, light an electromagnetic wave that travels in a vacuum, but both obey wave laws. He'd skimmed such ideas in textbooks long ago without much consideration, but now they lingered. If sound could be amplified, directed, and isolated by charm work, could similar principles be applied to light? Around him, students were already excited. The thought of projecting one's voice across an auditorium was thrilling. A Ravenclaw with spectacles whispered, "If I use Quietus in an exam, would it stop the professor hearing me ask someone for help?" The girl next to him rolled her eyes. "Won't the professor see your lips moving? You could hide under the desk. Not unless you can shrink yourself first." They dissolved into laughter. A student ahead turned and said without expression, "You do know the professor can use Quietus too. He could make the sound of you checking answers disappear. Or cast Sonorous on yourself in Diagon Alley. Loud voice, better haggling. Better to use Muffliato on the opposition so they can't hear your bid." Smirks and chuckles spread as more uses were imagined. Flitwick wrote the key points in midair with his wand. The handwriting glowed and floated. Sonorous, amplifies sound, projects across the room, wand pressed to throat. Quietus, dampens or eliminates sound in a specified area. The challenge lay in controlling Sonorous's direction and adjusting Quietus to silence or cut off sound at precise spots. "Begin practicing," Flitwick instructed. The classroom erupted. Shouts of Sonorous rose and fell in varying volumes, some booming like thunder, others barely audible, many trembling with nerves. Quietus attempts were comical. Someone muffled their neighbor only to have their own voice first. Another swung their wand too vigorously and nearly hit the student in front. Flitwick weaved between desks, his short form nimble, correcting pronunciations and gestures. Regulus touched his wand to his throat. Sonorous. His voice left his mouth and, under his will, streamed steadily toward the far window, making the glass tremble. It was effortless. With the thought of sending it there, the charm obeyed. He repeated it several times and then noticed something. As the directed sound passed through spaces where others practiced, it subtly deformed. His sound waves collided with theirs and produced faint distortions. He stared at his wand tip. Sound radiates from the throat, spreading outward in waves. That's natural transmission. The Sonorous charm uses magic to guide those waves, focusing them in a direction. Focusing, however, isn't the same as eliminating dispersion. The waves still spread, but the spread is narrowed, concentrating energy so it travels farther and sounds louder. Magic was acting like an acoustic lens, altering propagation paths. What if he forced the waves not to disperse at all? Regulus cast Sonorous again, this time intent not only on direction but on constraining dispersion, compressing the wave into as narrow a beam as possible, almost a line. The sound shot straight and stayed tight, with almost no dispersion along the path. The charm permitted it as long as he willed it. Now the question was one of principle. How did magic act on waves, and could the same action apply to light? The bell rang. Corridors filled with students by afternoon. Regulus pushed through the crowd and opened the heavy oak door of the library. The hinges creaked. Madame Pince peeked from between shelves, glanced at him, and retreated. He walked toward his usual corner by the window, best light in the room. Lily sat there, a book open before her, flipping pages. She looked up at his footsteps and smiled, the smile a touch stretched. "Long time no see." Regulus heard the edge in her voice and thought for a moment. He'd been full these past days. Classes, charm practice, experiments in the Forbidden Forest. No wonder. He set his books down and pulled out the chair opposite her. "Long time no see." Lily glanced at him, then returned to her reading. Regulus opened a dusty leather volume on the principles of basic charms. Few students bothered with these old, stiff books. To most, a charm was just a correct flick and incantation. He turned to the sonorous chapter and began reading. Outside, sunlight shifted slowly across the table, shadows lengthening as the day moved toward evening. Lily closed her book and, casually curious, asked, "You haven't been here in over a week. What have you been doing?" "Practicing magic," he said. "What kind?" "Something new. Still testing it." She nodded and didn't press. If he didn't volunteer, she wouldn't poke. She changed subjects, voice brightening. "I heard what happened in Defense Against the Dark Arts." Regulus looked up. "Professor Vance had you duel him, and you made him back down." Regulus smiled, corner of his mouth twitching. "It was just an exhibition match." News like that moved fast among students. It wasn't necessarily bad. Reputation was built on such things. Lily didn't reply at once. When she'd first heard, she'd been excited, not merely because he'd beaten a professor in a classroom spar, but because he was someone she knew. To hear of his strength made her proud in a way she couldn't explain. She'd wanted to ask him about it, but he'd avoided the library for over a week. Later, she'd heard from older students that a professor never used his full strength in a demonstration. It was for show. She understood that, but the happiness remained. Now the initial thrill had faded, leaving curiosity. So many versions of the event circulated, some exaggerated, some precise, yet one detail held. Regulus had only used second-year spells. Expelliarmus, Impedimentia, Stupefy, Transfiguration, textbook-level incantations, yet executed with a skill a second year shouldn't have. She remembered the last time he'd shown her a full shield charm and how she'd practiced until she could manage it, albeit unstably. The same spell in his hands was a different thing entirely, and she'd never quite understood why. "That's what I wanted to ask," she said, serious now. "The same spell is weak in other people's hands, but when you use it, people say it's fast, accurate, powerful," Regulus supplied. "How do you do it? Is it just practice, or is there some secret?" Regulus thought a moment. "Both." Before she could press further, he asked, "When you practice a spell, how do you do it?" Lily blinked. "Like the professor teaches. I read the book until I can cast it." "And after you can cast it," he prompted. She hesitated. "I practice it until I'm proficient, then move on to the next." The words left her feeling oddly exposed, as if something she'd taken pride in had been examined and found wanting. Regulus noticed but said nothing, his expression calm. "That's the school's way," he said. "When I practice a spell, casting it is only the beginning. After that, I make it faster, more accurate, and more stable." Lily looked up. He continued. "Speed isn't just about saying the words quickly. It's about reducing the time it takes for the magic to leave the wand. Accuracy isn't only aiming at the target, it's about predicting where the target will move and hitting that spot. Stability means the spell's trajectory stays true after it's launched, and the effect remains intact until it hits." She listened, frowning. Regulus smiled. "You called what you do proficiency. That's the foundation. What I'm talking about are the foundations beneath that, mastery of the basics, then building up." Lily tried to look fierce, arched her brows and turned down the corners of her mouth, but it came out half-hearted. She wanted to rebut him but found no mockery on his face, only a patient, natural certainty. She sighed softly and lowered her eyes. His words made sense. Regulus was rarely wrong, and besides, he was powerful. She remembered last year at this same table when he'd explained dueling. Understand the spell, master it physically, and anticipate consciously. Dueling is often a battle of minds before it's a clash of spells, he'd said. She still told herself those points whenever she practiced. Now, hearing him, she realized she'd only reached the first layer. She had spent time and effort, but her thinking had never moved in this direction. "The professors never taught any of this," she admitted, regret creeping into her tone. "Professors teach spells. not how to wield them, Regulus replied softly. He sat with the window behind him, light falling on his face. As always, he listened without impatience, explaining slowly instead of laughing. Lily looked out. The mist on the glass had cleared and bare branches swayed in the wind. After a moment, she asked, "Do you think I can learn it?" A smile tugged at Regulus's mouth and his eyes crinkled. "You're cleverer than I am. If I can do it, you can." Lily laughed, shooting him an annoyed glare. "Are you praising me or yourself?" He only smiled. The light outside dimmed into evening. Orange turned to a gray-blue, and the shelves slipped into shadow. Lily began packing her books. "Time to eat," she said. Regulus closed his and rose. As they reached the door, Lily hesitated. "Next time you practice, could you call me?" She sounded hopeful and a little unsure. Regulus turned and met her gaze. Of course, wanting to improve is always a good thing. Lily's eyes crinkled, and she made a soft noise that was either defiance or happiness. "Let's go. Dinner." She led the way, braid swinging, and they left the library together. The common room fireplace burned bright on Saturday morning, emerald green flames throwing a comfortable warmth across the room. Few students were up at this hour. Most of the young Slytherins were still tucked in bed. The other houses were the same. Regulus stepped out of the dormitory and paused in the corridor. Snape was sitting by the fireplace in a chair, holding nothing, just sitting. His gaze found Regulus the moment he appeared. Regulus glanced at him and could already guess the reason. They held each other's looks for a moment, neither moved. Then Snape stood and walked toward him. A corner of Regulus's mouth twitched. He turned and walked to a sofa farther from the hearth. Snape followed, but did not sit. He placed a small vial on the coffee table and remained standing. The vial was deep purple and opaque, even held up to the firelight. Its bottom could not be seen. The mouth was sealed with sealing wax, the seal pressed flat and the edges neatly trimmed. 2 runes were impressed into the wax. Regulus recognized one immediately, a stabilization rune used by potioneers to mark the grade of a finished product, an assurance that the potion's magical potency would not decay on its own after sealing. That technique was not something an ordinary student could master. The other rune was smaller, carved on the shoulder of the vial. Its strokes were simple and didn't match any standard system. It looked almost casual, but the careful execution made it clear it was deliberate. Regulus picked the vial up and swept it gently with his magical perception. The sensation was dense and heavy, a sustained weight, not something achieved simply by piling ingredients, but by technique. He had not delved deeply into potions. He could complete his coursework and occasionally produce work above classroom standards, but he had never pursued it obsessively. Still, the feeling told him the brew's completion and quality were high, quite professional. He also noticed the small shoulder rune, not a standard grading mark, but a personal sigil, Snape's. Regulus allowed himself a faint, inward amusement. As befits a future potion master, he was already starting to build a brand. He put the vial down and said, "Received." Snape didn't leave. Regulus did not look up, only said, "Sit." Snapey sat, trying to look relaxed but remaining visibly stiff, upright, arms not on the rests, as if ready to stand and go at any moment. The common room held only a few other figures. The fireplace crackled and threw their shadows long on the wall. After a while of silence, Snape spoke first. His eyes were fixed on the vial, not on Regulus. His voice was flat, but he was forcing it. "This is a thank you for the welcoming party." Regulus said nothing. He sank back into the sofa, hands folded over his abdomen, tilting his chin towards Snape. Snape continued, "This potion is not easy to brew, and the ingredients aren't cheap." He paused, as if waiting for a response. Regulus still didn't speak. He only let his eyes rest on the vial, emotionless. Snape looked at him, then down at the table again, voice dry. "The House of Black has potion shops in Diagon Alley, yes?" The moment the words were out, Snape's eye twitched. He'd spoken too soon. He knew it. He had wanted there to be something more, an explanation, an excuse, but the phrasing sounded clumsy and eager. He tried to find another phrase to cover for it, but nothing came. Regulus gave a neutral, and continued to look at him. Snape had not merely come to return a favor. Regulus had called him to the welcoming party to make an appearance in front of Horace Slughorn. Snape remembered the slight, and he could not bear to be indebted. He'd come to repay. But the potion was not merely a token of thanks. It was the best thing he could produce right now, and he wanted Regulus to see its value, to see what a half-blood could accomplish. He wanted to use the House of Black's outlets to sell his work. He pictured Regulus's connections, turning his products into money, lifting the label of poverty, and perhaps establishing a formal relationship with the House of Black, Snape supplying technique, the Black supplying shelves and clientele. Bundling those aims under the guise of gratitude, he persuaded himself it was not submission. He had, all the same, bowed. He simply had not admitted it to himself. Regulus finally withdrew his gaze. The matter could be negotiated, but not today. Snape's posture lacked the necessary assurance. He waited, receiving nothing. Regulus stood, slipped the vial into his pocket, and said, "It's time for breakfast." He took 2 steps, paused at the edge of the sofa, and added, almost without looking in Snape's direction, "The potion is well brewed." Then he walked straight for the common room door. Snape remained sitting, staring into the fireplace, the sentence turning over in his mind, "The potion is well brewed." What was that meant to be? Recognition? Indifference? A casual remark with no intent? And that had it been acknowledgement or a desire to avoid the conversation? He thought and could not find a satisfying answer. His thoughts knotted and tangled like a ruined brew. At 12 Grimmauld Place, the fireplace burned, and documents lay spread across the desk. Orion sat behind it. The folder in front of him had been closed and set to his right. He had begun work on the Bulgarian matter as soon as he'd received the letter. Georgy Stoyanov, director of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, 53 years old, 8 years in office, cautious. Orion had people on the ground for 3 days and found 2 things. First, during Stoyanov's tenure, 2 cross-border transport permits had been approved that contained procedural flaws. Not enough for dismissal, but sufficient to cause trouble if someone pressed. Second, his son's position in the Bulgarian Ministry of Magic was up for reevaluation next quarter, and the result would depend on the opinion of a certain department head above him. Orion had no intention of using the crude permits. They were too obvious. Nor did he wish to move directly against that department head. The House of Black did not play that way. He wanted Stoyanov to realize the pressure himself. That evening, Orion apparated to Sofia and arrived at the Dark Amber Magic Club. The club admitted only wizards carrying membership badges. Within the Bulgarian wizarding circles, those who knew of it understood what it represented. Orion landed in a side courtyard and was led down a passage that bypassed the main hall. The guide brought him to a private room and pushed the door open. A tall attendant in a dark robe, hood up, stood half a step behind Orion. The guide's eyes lingered on the attendant for a moment before they moved on. The room was small, 2 chairs and a low table. Local Bulgarian herbal tea sat ready, deep gold when brewed, with a faint halo around the rim. The fireplace burned with blue flames, lower in temperature than British orange fires, but lasting longer. Portraits from the history of magic in the Balkans hung on the wall. The figures inside murmured in Bulgarian, their words unintelligible to Orion. Stoyanov was already there. He rose and extended a hand. His voice was steady, his smile measured. The handshake lasted a fraction shorter than custom. "I've long heard of the great name of the head of the House of Black." After that brief greeting, Orion sat opposite him. The attendant retreated to the doorway and stood silent and still like a breathing wall. Stoyanov's eyes flicked toward the attendant once more, before returning to Orion. He picked up his cup. "The weather is nice today." "Sofia is warmer than London this time of year," Orion replied. "We've had frost already." He took a sip and set his cup down. "How has the conservation area been lately? Are you sufficiently staffed?" Stoyanov said, "We're managing. We've replenished some forces over the years." Orion, "The House of Black has a magical creature ranch in Ireland. If your conservation area has needs, we can provide technical support." He added casually, "Not as a trade, just an exchange between our houses." "That would be welcome," Stoyanov said with a smile. He sat attentive. The head of the House of Black in Bulgaria meant something important. The two spoke a few minutes longer about the climate and recent moves by various European ministries of magic, each sentence measured and unhurried. The more they spoke, the more Stoyanov felt something amiss. Years at the Bulgarian ministry had taught him to read intentions, direct offers, vague evasions, coercions, and he had met them all. But Orion's angle today remained elusive. Orion mentioned recent personnel shifts in the British ministry and, as if recollecting, dropped a name casually. A certain department head has been busy wrapping up a cross-border collaboration recently. The other party is the House of Black. It's almost finished. He lifted his cup and sipped. He mentioned your side in Bulgaria. He's old friends with Boyan Petrov and said he would like to introduce us sometime. Stoyanov's hand paused around his teacup. Boyan Petrov. The name clicked into place and pulled the rest of the map with it. Petrov's old friend just happened to be in the middle of an unfinished collaboration with the House of Black. Whether that deal completed would depend on a word from the Blacks. Orion continued. That department head is easy to speak with. The collaboration has been pleasant, and there will be opportunities in future. Stoyanov set his cup down and laughed thinly. Yes, that gentleman has always had good relations with our side. Orion smiled, and the conversation shifted. I heard there are a few whomping willows in the conservation area, growing quite well. Stoyanov's expression tightened. He knew this might be the true subject. Yes, those trees are one of the area's proudest holdings, Orion said, lightly. The House of Black has always been very interested in that species. He added, offhandedly, purely academic curiosity, nothing else implied. The last phrase made the casualness deliberate. Stoyanov looked at him. All the unspoken pieces had been set on the table. The department head, Boyan Petrov, his son's review, the House of Black's unfinished collaboration, and now a question about humping willows. Orion had not had to name the threat. His surname and station, House of Black, Sacred 28, a member of the Wizengamot, said enough. It wasn't worth risking his son for a few trees. More importantly, the trees were not his to trade. The son was. Tea finished, Orion rose. Today has been very pleasant. Stoyanov stood to see him out. Orion cut him off. I'll take my leave. Stoyanov watched him go, then returned to the chair and the now cold teacup. The halo around the rim had dissipated. The tea was dark and reflective of nothing. He thought for a long time. No single sentence had plainly threatened him, but he knew what was expected. 3 days later, Orion received a document. Several humping willow saplings with cultivation instructions. Saplings? Orion frowned. Saplings would take 60 years to mature. 60 years was too long. He wrote back, the House of Black is willing to provide 5 years of herb garden output support to the Bulgarian conservation area, and we look forward to deeper cooperation between our houses in other fields. 5 days later, a second document arrived. The saplings had been replaced with adult plants, 2 of them. Orion read the paperwork, placed it in the folder to the right of his desk, and picked up his quill to write a short note to Regulus. He sealed it and handed it to Creature. During dinner at Hogwarts, an owl flew into the Great Hall, headed straight for Regulus. It dropped a letter and flew away. He opened it, Orion's tidy handwriting brief, 2 humping willows to arrive in Cornwall before Christmas. Regulus read the line twice, folded the letter, slipped it into his pocket, and resumed eating, knife and fork in hand. Chapter 242, Be an Abstract Person. At 9 o'clock, in the room of requirement, Avery and Alex were still sparring. They'd been at it all day and had even come back at night on their own. Regulus stepped out of his private hut, glanced over, and nodded with satisfaction. Let them play during the day. This was the age for it. Compared to that rowdy lot of Hufflepuffs who could play until midnight on weekends, they were practically disciplined. On the other side of the training ground, Hermes was buried in a pile of dummies, unarmed, ducking and weaving between them. His wand lay unused. He relied entirely on his body to dodge the spells that burst from the dummies in every direction. He slipped, rolled, and twisted, avoiding one curse after another. When he couldn't avoid a hit, he took it with his arm, grunted as the force sent him skidding, climbed back up, and kept going. He had trained all day. In the morning, he'd practiced magic until his reserves were drained. Then, when his power was exhausted, he had gone to the dummy pile to practice purely physical endurance. Stamina, reflexes, footwork, dodging. As soon as his magic recovered, he'd go back to spell work. That determination made him far ahead of most young wizards. Most would stop when their magic ran out, sit wait, or leave. Hermes didn't. He used even the downtime to train his body. It hadn't been a suggestion from Regulus. It was his own idea. Maybe, Regulus thought, Hermes had taken inspiration from him. Regulus remembered clearly the time 5 spells had been fired at once, and even more clearly that the shield charm couldn't stop spells from Regulus. He couldn't even defend against the casually cast impedimenta. It broke through on impact. If it couldn't be blocked, it had to be dodged. Whether Hermes could always dodge was another matter, but at least he tried. Regulus did not stop him. Physical training was a good thing. If magic ever failed, if someone lost their wand, what would they do? Muggles trained their bodies. Why shouldn't wizards? He withdrew to his hut and sat cross-legged. He had spent the afternoon in the library, studying the sonorous charm and its principles. He'd realized the principle of convergence could be applied to Lumos. Treat the spell as 2 walls pushing light waves toward the center. The harder the push, the narrower the beam. A ball of light formed before him, Lumos, flickering with a high-frequency pulse. The color shifted faintly, silver-white to pale gold and back. But the important thing was the frequency, brightness, intensity, wavelength. Everything was changing. The hut filled with that pulsing glow. Staring at it too long made the brain feel as if it were swaying with the rhythm, inducing a faint dizziness. Regulus concentrated. The light began to converge, the sphere's edges folding inward as if squeezed by invisible palms. The beam narrowed from fist thickness to finger thickness, then to the width of a pen. Finally, it condensed into a thin line, shooting from the tip of his wand and striking the far wall as a pinpoint. Lumos was one of the most basic spells for young wizards, and for Regulus altering it was effortless. Alex could set Lumos to 10 different intensities and switch quickly. Regulus could change it by thought alone, but what he was doing now was more than simple beam control. He was building a compound application, light source magic, that used Lumos as a foundation but layered techniques that weren't conventional spells. Encoding light this way wasn't a single spell. It was a method, pure control of magical energy. You could copy the method, but there was no neat incantation for it. It required strong magical perception and extremely precise control to converge beams and encode information. Without perception, you couldn't see the subtle changes in light. Without control, you couldn't set frequency and phase with accuracy. Occlumency had helped during development to stabilize his mind, filter external interference, and create an isolated mental space to store extreme pure emotional samples he could later reuse. But the decisive tool was his deconstruction of legilimency. Regulus had dismantled legilimency, extracting the mechanics of mental positioning and connection, and borrowed those parts to inject encoded information into the surface of a target's consciousness through light. That part didn't rely on magic in the usual spell structure sense. It relied on an understanding of the mental realm. He also used Muggle physics, wavelength, frequency, amplitude, phase, and translated those concepts into the language of magic. Density of magical fluctuations, strength of spell energy, and the deflection of emotional tendencies. Most fundamentally, he used the magical texture of the Patronus as a binder, forcing together the otherwise incompatible elements of legilimency and Lumos. The Patronus was the conceptual cornerstone that elevated his beam manipulation into a carrier of information and ideas. Finally, an iron mental will completed the structure. All of these combined produced a magic that came from his mind and became usable. When he let the ball of light fade, the hut darkened, save for the low fireplace glow. It was still experimental. Many problems remained: encoding efficiency, stability of reception, shielding from environmental interference. But he could already convert visible light into invisible bands. Ultraviolet was ideal, invisible to the naked eye and matching the compressed beam he wanted. Compress visible wavelengths down into the ultraviolet so the opponent wouldn't even realize they'd been irradiated. That was the essence of a good sneak attack. But magical perception could pick it up, so that too needed a fix. If he solved those issues, he could pack far more: emotional triggers, psychological breaching. A beam could overload the target's mind with a brief crash or slowly magnify existing weaknesses until a cautious person became paralyzed with fear or the competitive became reckless. Fear, excitement, contempt, trust, impatience, arrogance, all could be weaponized. There was also a broadcast mode. The light didn't just converge, it could also spread. On a battlefield, a light sphere could explode in the sky and the whole field would be flooded. His own side would receive tactical overlays, the trajectories of incoming spells, where reinforcements would appear, which spells to coordinate, no shouting, no delay. The enemy would receive something else, fear, hesitation, confusion. The same beam, two kinds of information. His side got clarity, the enemy got interference. He would be the command center. Regulus let his thoughts go further. If this magic ever worked on a truly global scale, if he could scatter light through the atmosphere and reach everyone who could see it almost simultaneously, he could send a sentence, an image, a sound to all humans at once. He smiled at the absurdity of it. If that day came, what would he say? I, Regulus Black, am speaking to the whole world. He shook his head and banished the idea. That was why he had to stop Aragog from spreading the work. If Dumbledore even got a whiff of what this could do, he would be sure to overreact. A flash of light could plant a thought, and the subject would believe it their own. If anyone guessed the end goal of this method, Regulus would become the greatest threat to the international statute of wizarding secrecy. Muggles didn't know about wizards because wizards hid. If a wizard could make every Muggle see an image, hear a phrase, and have the same thought at once, secrecy would be obliterated. The entire order of things would be rewritten. So it had to be hidden and developed in secret. He let himself drift to another darkly amusing thought. What if one day he announced to all wizards that Lord Voldemort was the result of a love potion, or spread some other juicy rumor? It would be entertaining. He stopped himself and moved on to testing the spatial network. Several balls of light rose from his fingertips and slipped into invisible channels. They flew through space, blinking in and out, their paths crossing but never colliding. Seconds later, they emerged simultaneously from different directions, overhead, behind him, from corners at his feet. 8 balls burned at once, lighting the hut. He'd kept 12 space anchors in place, and now he could store 8 spells at once, each for up to a minute. He tried another configuration, focused on instantaneous, simultaneous discharge instead of duration. 13 Expelliarmus curses fired from separate directions and struck the opposite wall, producing only a single unified sound. He stood, opened the hut door, and walked out. Hermes lay on the floor, limbs splayed, chest heaving. Avery and Alex were still at the dummy pile, but their steps were unsteady and their spells wild. Regulus called a halt. The dummies obeyed. The two of them staggered over, flopped down beside Hermes, one on his left, one on his right, and lay there waiting to be picked up. Regulus flicked his wand, and their bodies floated up, as light as feathers. He carried them back to the dormitory, dropped them on the floor, and didn't fuss further. Avery was first on his feet, staggering off to wash. Alex was slower, and Hermes the slowest. After they cleaned up, they each slipped under the covers. The fire still burned in the hearth. Alex, Regulus said. Alex turned. Yes? Tell Samuel Vance and Lena Costa to come to the Great Hall at noon tomorrow for lunch, Regulus said. I have something to discuss with them. Alex blinked. At the start of term, Regulus had told him to keep Samuel and Costa low profile. Alex had followed without asking, vaguely sensing it had to do with things beyond school. 2 half-bloods hardly earned special protection under normal circumstances. Later, during the prefect contest, they'd run errands and contacted Professor Slughorn. In the last defense class, Regulus had arranged separate practice sessions for them. In Alex's eyes, Regulus had been protecting them, rewarding them more than they deserved. They usually ate at odd hours or when few people were around. They avoided the main meal times. Now Regulus wanted them in the Great Hall at noon, sitting at the Slytherin table with everyone else. Who was this meant to be seen by? Or was there another purpose? Alex thought it over and couldn't figure it out. Avery, exhausted, would have jumped up if he had energy, but he merely lay there, eyes rolling as if scheming. He met Alex's look and then both turned away. Hermes faced the wall and breathed evenly, maybe asleep, maybe not caring. The hearth's flames danced their last and died. The dormitory dimmed, and they went to sleep. Sunday noon, the Great Hall. The 4 long house tables were crowded, voices blending into a constant hum, but each table carried its own mood. Gryffindor was the loudest. Boys stood to reach for roast. Girls laughed until they cried. A goblet was overturned and pumpkin juice ran across the table while the nearest boy swore and mopped it up. Hufflepuff buzzed with a different energy, less sharp, but denser, a jumble of overlapping conversations in which no one could tell who was speaking and who was merely listening. Ravenclaw kept to itself in small, low-voiced groups, preoccupied and indifferent to everything else. Slytherin was different again. It was lively, but with restraint. Voices stayed low, posture was perfect, robes uncreased and collars buttoned precisely. The younger years ate with quiet manners, cutlery making no sound. The older students treated lunch like a small social gathering. A cluster of sixth-year boys lounged back in their chairs, pumpkin juice held like wine, quietly debating recent reshufflings in the Ministry of Magic, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, a vacancy in international magical cooperation, which family had filed an application. Girls nearby tilted their heads to listen, interjecting substantive comments rather than idle gossip. Conversation jumped from appointments to marriage alliances, from business dealings to ministry proposals. Everyone spoke, everyone weighed what was said, which sentence carried weight, which speaker could be useful. Regulus sat in the middle of the second-year section, a half-eaten plate of grilled fish and potatoes before him. He glanced toward the upper years, then looked down again and continued cutting his potatoes. Monkey see, monkey do. This was the same choreography he had watched at home. How his father negotiated matters behind the study door, how his mother made polite conversation at tea. Lift the cup deliberately, set it down lightly, never speak too plainly, but make your meaning understood. He had been taught that routine by years of watching. No one needed to tell him. It wasn't a bad system. Most Slytherin graduates would have to navigate these circles, tailored robes, banquets and conference rooms, trading favors and marriages with others who wore custom robes. Wizarding society was small and closed, and this subset of Slytherins had carved an even smaller world inside it. They used etiquette, bloodline, wealth, and status to wall themselves off. Outsiders couldn't get in, and those inside found it hard to leave. Yet those walls tied them to the larger society just as much. They were the core of it. Regulus speared a potato and chewed. He didn't mean to criticize. The order had reasons for existing. A ruling circle kept by family lines would have crumbled long ago without these rules. He was part of it, a core member of the pure blood circle. The House of Black both created and benefited from this order. But after living in it so long, it was easy to mistake order for power, to believe politeness meant worth. Few paused to think that people were polite because the wall behind you still stood. Regulus knew that in a few years Lord Voldemort would change that. Those people at the far end of the long table, goblets in hand discussing marriages and futures, would one day kneel before him, kiss the hem of his robes, and call him master. Their tailored robes and reserved tones would remain, but the dignity would be gone. Only fear would remain. Lord Voldemort would not care for niceties. He would demand kneeling and would spare no one for the sake of a family name. What mattered then would be raw power. Regulus set down his goblet. At that moment, two figures entered from the far end of the Slytherin table. Samuel Vance and Lena Costa. No one spared them more than a passing glance. That indifference was natural, like not noticing an empty chair in the corner. They were used to it themselves, heads down, eyes searching for a place at the edge. Then they caught sight of Regulus. He sat in the middle of the second-year section, with two empty seats beside him. Alex was to his left, Avery and Hermes opposite. Samuel and Lena paused, exchanged a look, and started toward him. Heads turned. Not out of malice, simply because motion in the periphery attracts notice. People glanced up, and then realized who was approaching. Two lower-year half-bloods walking to the very center of the Slytherin table drew the room's attention. The upper-year conversation died. A hand froze with a goblet in midair. The half-bloods at the table's edge looked over with complicated expressions. A week earlier, in Defense Against the Dark Arts, Black had paired Casbert and Rosier with these two. That incident had spread through the ranks, shrugged off as a classroom matter. But this was Sunday lunch, when the whole house was present, and the optics were different. Slytherins played and joked. On fine days, they picnicked on the shores of the Black Lake, argued over exploding Snap, but they were touchy about certain things. Pure blood, half-blood, status, factional lines, words that might be casual elsewhere carried weight here. The smallest gesture could be read in many ways and pushed toward the conclusion people wanted. And this was Regulus, the heir to the House of Black, a prefect who'd asserted himself since his first year, the sort of boy who could make older students step aside in corridors. If he chose to make a public display, half of Slytherin could rally around him on a moment's notice. But he hadn't. He kept to his small circle of roommates, formed no cliques, declared no stances. That ambiguity bred speculation. Now 2 half-bloods were walking to sit by him. Regulus swallowed, set down his cutlery, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and lifted his pumpkin juice in a casual, unhurried motion. He looked up as they arrived. Samuel and Lena wore standard school robes, plain fabric, perfectly serviceable. Both were not undersized. Hogwarts didn't starve its students. Their faces betrayed nervousness and excitement, but in different ways. Lena stood straight, chin a little high, eyes bright as if waiting for a signal. Samuel's shoulders were slightly hunched, brows drawn, as if anxious. Regulus saw through it instantly. An act. Samuel was actually calmer than Lena. Lena's eagerness was genuine. Samuel affected nervousness to observe and measure. Regulus found it interesting and decided not to call him out. He had a clear impression of them now. Lena, sharp, direct, quick to decide. When asked to fetch Slughorn before, she had left immediately while Samuel still hesitated. She seemed brisk but was tougher inwardly than she appeared. Samuel, low-key, cautious, slow outwardly, but actually composed and clear-headed. Given equal resources and status as pure bloods, they might outpace many of their peers. But that line of thinking was pointless. Those born into privilege often had different temperaments. People like Samuel and Lena could be useful, but they needed shaping. As they weren't enough to change the system. Regulus pushed those thoughts aside and said, levelly, "Sit and eat first." Lena sat down directly beside Alex with quick, efficient movements and immediately focused on her plate, eating without looking up. Samuel hesitated a beat, glanced at Lena and then at Regulus, and took the seat next to her. He lowered his head to eat, quietly. Regulus wasn't acting at random. During the first-year holiday, when Bella had come to Grimmauld Place to deliver the Dark Enlightenment, she'd told him something on her way out. Sometimes, too much protection dulls a person's resolve. She had been criticizing his habit of protecting Samuel and Lena at Hogwarts. When he first received Bella's letter in his first year, he'd known that Voldemort's circle was watching him. Such attention implied ongoing surveillance, tests, and nudges toward declaring a stance. Regulus didn't think Bella's warning reflected Voldemort's direct orders. It was natural that Voldemort noticed him, but it was beneath Voldemort to bother with whether a first-year protected 2 half-bloods at school. Voldemort's gaze wouldn't fall that low. Bella, however, interpreted everything through the lens of her master. What Voldemort did was crucial to her, and by extension anything she thought he might have thought, or should think, mattered too. In Regulus's mind, the Voldemort he'd imagine was not the theatrical cackler, but the quiet, terrifying figure who made people's skin crawl merely by being present. Darkness, fear, cold oppression. Provoking him outright would be foolish, but doing something that revealed a spine to Bella, showing her he had an edge, was the right scale. Bella was a core of the Death Eaters, one of Voldemort's most trusted lieutenants. A little friction with her would register with the inner circle without being an outright affront. She might find a bold, opinionated child interesting, rather than merely timid. Regulus set down his fork. Samuel and Lena had finished and sat waiting politely. He glanced at them and said in his usual flat tone, 2 o'clock this afternoon, go to the library and help me find some books. Lena nodded. Samuel nodded too. Regulus stood. Avery, Alex, and Hermes rose at the same time. Lena and Samuel hurried to follow. Around them, the conversations at the Slytherin table thickened, denser than before. Chapter 244, 2 p.m., Library. Regulus sat in his usual spot by the window, a bound collection of back issues of Transfiguration Today spread open before him. He had stopped on a page in the middle and didn't bother to turn any further. The moment had arrived. Finding books was anyone's task. Even Madame Pince could fetch tomes with her eyes closed. Asking Samuel and Lena to do it was primarily an assessment. Could they handle a task? Would they do it well? And what would their attitudes be afterward? This was the first gate. Once it opened, there would be a path forward. At exactly 2 o'clock, the pair appeared at the end of the stacks. Regulus did not look up. He knew they had been waiting at the entrance for 20 minutes. He even knew they had paced the corridor, glancing at the clock now and then, breath quickening and slowing as their magical fluctuations rose and fell. They had arrived early, but had not entered until the appointed time. They pushed the door open and crossed to stand opposite him. Lena held her chin slightly up, eyes bright, a faint smile at the corners of her mouth. Her hands hung at her sides, fingertips lightly worrying the edge of her robes. Samuel's shoulders were hunched, head lowered, gaze locked on the tabletop, avoiding eye contact. Regulus finally looked up and nodded toward the chairs opposite him. Lena sat first. The chair scraped forward half an inch and steadied silently. Samuel was slower, pulling his chair out and then settling, hands resting on his knees, motionless. Regulus let his gaze slide away. If they wanted to perform, let them. In Slytherin, people clawed desperately to rise, joining inner circles, seeking acceptance, grasping any chance to transcend their stations. Opportunities were scarce. Severus Snape had talent, potion skill notable even across the British wizarding world, and an aptitude for the dark arts that had produced spells like Sectum Sempra while he was still a student. Regulus thought the intent of that particular spell was wanting and its strength only average, but compared to most, it had been impressive. Yet talent alone did not buy entrance into the true halls of power. That was still determined by birth. Pureblood families controlled the core resources, connections and information built over centuries and encoded into family trees. A half-blood named Snape, no matter how skilled, could make a comfortable life, win honors, perhaps publish and earn grudging respect, but he would never be one of them. Only when Voldemort began smashing the old order did men like Snape gain a real chance, not to be accepted but to rise. When those who once knelt were forced down, the talented could stand. Regulus glanced at Samuel and Lena again. If they proved efficient, useful, and loyal, he would be willing, pleased even, to feed them resources and see how high they could climb. Two capable half-bloods established in Slytherin would say a great deal. Placed under Alex, a moderate pureblood who led half-bloods, they might become a useful outward face for his small circle. After graduation, Regulus would need people to go where he could not. Some tasks were inappropriate for family members to execute. Some information could not flow through family channels. Those roles would be theirs. He knew the trend. Half-bloods and Muggleborns would inevitably rise as Voldemort tore apart the old pure-blood houses. Positions would open and be filled. Numbers would shift. The timing was right. Those he propped up would have to owe him. For now, though, they had to pass the test. Protecting them would be simple, one word, but more required, more proof. Regulus produced a slip of paper from his sleeve, placed it on the table, and pushed it toward the center. Lena was quick. Almost as soon as it stopped, she reached out, touched it, and drew it in. The paper listed 5 things: aerodynamics, jet propulsion, information transmission, wave mechanics, optical principles. None of those terms were of magic. Lena did not know them, though her good home education allowed her to read them. She read them with a puzzled frown that quickly smoothed away. She glanced at Regulus briefly, then handed the slip to Samuel. He read it, and head still lowered, pushed the paper back to Regulus without comment. Their faces held similar restrained expressions, hard to tell whether of surprise or confusion. Either way, neither allowed reaction. Regulus tapped his index finger on the table. The paper browned at the edges, curled, and turned to ash. A fine powder sank into the grain of the wood and vanished, all of it in the span of a blink. Lena's eyes brightened, and Samuel's widened. Regulus leaned back, composed. "Any questions?" Lena spoke first, tentative. "Mr. Black." Regulus shook his head once. "This is Hogwarts. We are classmates. There is no Mr." Lena brightened at the correction, then leaned forward a little. "Black?" Regulus did not react. His expression stayed calm, neither inviting nor cold. Lena found the right tone. "When should we deliver the items to you?" "No rush," Regulus said. "Keep them once you have them. Someone will come to collect." Lena nodded and murmured, "And you?" Regulus asked Samuel. Samuel kept his head down, but Regulus could feel his magical fluctuation, more intense than Lena's. Excitement kept under tight control. His brow was knit, lips pressed, fingers curled on his knees. After a moment, he raised his eyes, determined. "Just these? Do you need more?" Regulus shook his head. "No, I'll tell you if I need anything else." Samuel nodded. "Understood." That was all. Regulus waited a beat longer. Neither of them spoke again. "All right, go and handle it." They rose. As they headed for the stacks, Regulus's voice followed them, calm as if mentioning something trivial. "From today on, you don't have to hide while eating in Slytherin anymore." Lena's steps faltered. She didn't look back, but her shoulders lifted and fell as if she breathed more freely. Samuel paused, turned, glanced once at Regulus. The expression in his eyes could have been gratitude or something else, and then he and Lena left. Regulus watched their backs vanish between the bookshelves. The earlier wait had been to see whether they would ask why. They had not. Good. People who did not ask why were easier to use. Next, he would watch whether they took initiative or bungled things. If they succeeded, they could continue to be useful. If not, they would not. He had deliberately given no explicit instructions about secrecy. Propriety had to be theirs. Even if the hunt for Muggle books drew notice, Regulus was not worried. A few physics tomes would mean nothing to Voldemort's followers, whose heads were full of dark arts, bloodlines, and power. How Muggles made things fly or packed information into light would be incomprehensible or irrelevant to them. If anyone inquired, it would most likely be Bella, but that was acceptable. He had already let her see what he wanted her to see that afternoon. This task was peripheral. It was better if she noticed, but not essential. Lena and Samuel should be sensible enough to know what could be said and what must be kept silent. Outside the library window, the afternoon sun broke into glitter across the black lake. The forbidden forest lay a dark, dense green. The homping willow's branches drooped, stirring occasionally like a dozing beast. Younger students ran across the lawn, some chasing model golden snitches, others throwing exploding snap cards that popped and sent laughter flying. By the lake's edge, two small figures strolled arm in arm. One had red hair, Lily, and the other, pale blonde, was Marcia Fleury. They walked slowly, stopping to whisper and laugh. Marcia gave Lily a playful nudge. Lily dodged and leaned back in. Youthful energy radiated from them even at a distance. The corners of Regulus's mouth twitched upward. He raised a forefinger and pointed at the lowest branch of an old oak outside the window. A leaf trembled, its stem twisting as its blade began to change. The edges drew in, veins straightened, and its deep yellow shifted to a grayish-white. The leaf became a palm-sized piece of parchment, edges neat, surface smooth. Ink surfaced in the center. The parchment folded upward on both sides, bulged in the middle, a pointed head extending from the front and a fan-shaped tail unfolding from the rear. A small gray-white bird, slightly larger than a sparrow, shook itself and launched into the air, circling twice before letting out a crisp chirp. It flew toward the lake. Lily was squatting to pick up a stone, about to skip it across the water, when the bird landed on the rock in front of her and cocked its head. Startled, she reached out. The bird hopped onto her index finger and hooked its claws. Then its feathers tucked in, wings folded, head retracted, and the body lengthened and flattened into a sheet of parchment resting in her palm. She read Regulus's handwriting at a glance. After dinner, 8 o'clock, the abandoned classroom at the end of the fourth-floor corridor. Lily stared at the single line for 2 seconds, then turned her head toward the distant library windows. The castle was far away and the panes small. She could not see the people inside clearly, but she knew he was there. She waved both hands, jumped once, then again, hair whipping over her shoulder. Marcia tried to tug her back, but Lily kept waving. Behind the glass, Regulus watched the small, eager figure hopping on the lawn and smiled. The afternoon sun lay across the black lake, scattering light on the water in shifting patches as small waves broke and reformed. The lawns were warm and pleasant to sit on. Laughter drifted from a distance. A few young students were racing across the grass in a tangle of limbs. Someone was shoved, scrambled up, and kept chasing. Nearby under a tree, a handful of older girls watched and laughed. Lily stood on a stone by the lake, jumping up and down, laughing aloud. Her voice was clear and bright, carried away by the breeze. Marcia stood beside her, smiling at Lily's energy. After a few more jumps, Lily stopped. Her cheeks were flushed and her breath a little quick, but the smile never left her face. She reached for the note in her hand, intending to tuck it away. The moment her fingers brushed the inner pocket of her robe, the paper began to change. Gray-white, shifting back to dark yellow, the edges curling, veins returning, the stiff surface softening into a slightly waxy leaf. Lily puckered, then carefully slipped the leaf into her pocket. Leaves were useful too. She could always use it as a bookmark. Watching Lily, Marcia found a name come to mind. Regulus Black. That Lily was involved with him had been known since last term. It wasn't a secret, and Lily hadn't hidden it. Sometimes when Lily returned from the library, she would sit by her bed, lost in thought, a smile half unconsciously playing on her lips. Marcia had seen it, but never asked. She was older now. She had learned to share last semester, and she had made a friend in Lily. She had also learned discretion. Some things were best left unspoken. Still, Marcia couldn't help thinking. Slytherin and Gryffindor, pureblood core and Muggleborn, the House of Black and the Evans family, those pairings looked wrong no matter how she turned them over. The House of Black was one of the sacred 28, its family tree stretching back generations. The Avances were an ordinary Muggle family from Cokeworth. Placing the two names together felt like forcing two worlds into one. Marcia did not mean to look down on Lily. The Fleury family was pure blood, though not at the very top, and she knew the social rules. She had heard the way the older ladies spoke of the House of Black and how they muttered about those who associated with Muggles. But seeing Lily's genuine happiness, she kept her thoughts to herself and put a smile back on her face. Lily was happy now. That was enough. She sighed inwardly at how quickly she worried about such things. They were young. What would she be like when they were older? Lily finished putting the leaf away and looked up to find Marcia staring at her. "What's wrong?" she asked. Marcia leaned her chin on Lily's shoulder and lowered her voice, making it sound like a question and a tease both. "Who wrote it?" "A friend," Lily said, smiling. Marcia raised an eyebrow and let the last word draw out as if she were testing the name. "The Slytherin Black?" Lily felt a little annoyed. Marcia never could bring herself to call Regulus by his name and always added Slytherin first as if to place him. She didn't know if the Fleury family had some lingering prejudice against the House of Black or whether Marcia had picked up family whispers. She had tried to ask before, but Marcia always evaded, so she stopped pressing. Lily let the brief annoyance pass and nodded. It's him." Marcia's face changed. Her eyes narrowed and her mouth turned serious. "Then are you coming back to the dorm tonight?" Lily laughed, as if she'd heard something impossible, then lunged after Marcia and nearly tumbled over a stone. "What are you thinking? Regulus asked me to practice spells." Marcia froze for a beat and then adopted a mock solemnity. "Then you must learn well. If you pick up even a bit of Slytherin Black's skill, you'll be formidable." "Do you know how powerful he is?" Lily asked. Regulus rarely boasted. Aside from that, one time in the library, when he let her feel a shield charm, he hadn't shown her much. She knew he could do things, that he was capable, but not to what extent. Marcia considered and shook her head. "I don't know, but my family says this generation of Blacks will produce a formidable man." She leaned in conspiratorially. "I overheard them saying we should make sure the young students in the family keep friendly with the Slytherin Black, or at least don't make a bad impression." Hearing that, Lily felt a strange mix of emotions. She was pleased, certainly, not because the pureblood families wanted to befriend Regulus, but because Regulus himself was favored. Beneath the happiness, though, something like a small hollow rose up in her chest, bubbling up and then popping into a faint emptiness. It was real, however, and she pushed it down and smiled. "Let's go." She grabbed Marcia's hand and started off for the castle at a quick pace. "Slow down," Marcia called as she chased after her, skirts flaring. Lily's laughter floated back to them as they ran through the gate and into the dormitory. Inside, Lily began rifling through her wardrobe. She didn't have many robes. The little cabinet was crowded. She shoved some aside, pondering. Marcia leaned against the bedpost and watched, puzzlement and amusement on her face. Why, just because Regulus had invited her to practice, did Lily suddenly feel the need to change? "This one?" Lily held up a dark blue robe trimmed with silver at the collar, a Christmas gift from her mother. She'd liked it when she first opened it, but on, it felt too somber and made her look older. Marcia frowned. Too formal. You're practicing spells, not attending a banquet. Lily shoved it back and pulled out a plain light gray robe with subtle cuff patterns, comfortable, softer than the uniform. Too plain, she said. Marcia's smirk began, and then she caught herself. You're only going to practice. Lily gave her a mock glare, and the sentence died on Marcia's lips. She pointed at another robe with a serious, advising expression. How about that one? Lily looked. Pale purple with simple white trim at the collar and cuffs, clean and unflashy. She'd worn it a few times last month. Marcia had liked it. Lily held it against herself and nodded. Marcia approved. Lily gathered a white undershirt, a scarf, and wondered about her hair. Marcia advised no hairband. The scarf was too thick, and the shoes didn't need changing. In the end, Lily tied her red hair into a ponytail with a pale purple band. At that moment, the dormitory door swung open. Susan Hopkins came in with a stack of books and stopped, blinking at the bed piled with clothes. Is this a date? She asked. Lily flushed and hurried to explain. No, Professor Regulus asked me to practice spells with him tonight. Susan's eyes flicked from Lily to Marcia. Marcia's subtle nod changed Susan's expression from curiosity to understanding, and she abandoned her books to help. Then how about this? She offered, lifting the light gray robe. Lily shook her head. The three of them fussed for a few minutes and finally settled on the pale purple robe with the white shirt underneath. Lily's collar was turned out and her cuffs neat. Marcia and Susan both stepped back to appraise her and nodded in approval. Susan, also Muggle-born, had a fairly close but competitive friendship with Lily, learned rivalry over grades rather than anything personal. Lily tended to be stronger in most subjects, especially potions, where Professor Slughorn often noticed her. But between Susan and Marcia, Lily felt closer with Marcia for reasons she couldn't quite name. That evening, at the Slytherin table in the Great Hall, Regulus finished his last bite and set down his knife and fork. You lot practice on your own tonight, he said. I'll be round later. Hermes didn't even look up, making a muffled sound and going on poking at his potatoes. Avery and Alex exchanged glances that said curiosity, gossip, and an unsure question about whether to pry. They looked at Regulus, hoping for something in his face. He showed nothing. He sipped pumpkin juice, glanced aside, and the two of them immediately lowered their heads and returned to their food, but the under-table kicks began, Avery nudging Alex and Alex kicking back. Regulus ignored them. He'd give them extra practice later. How much depended on his mood. At 8 o'clock, on the fourth-floor corridor, the lights were dim and the floor was usually empty. Torches were spaced out, throwing half-light and deep shadow along the passage. The portraits were quiet. Some tilted their heads while others turned away. The door to the abandoned classroom stood ajar. Regulus pushed it open and stepped inside. Lily stood by the window waiting for him. She turned at the sound and smiled. You're here. Regulus nodded and slipped a locking charm across the door. The bolt slid into place. He looked around the classroom. Desks and chairs were heaped in a corner, their surfaces dusted, and chalk smudges ghosted a blackboard from a lesson half erased. With a casual gesture, he sent the desks and chairs sliding aside, leaving a clear space in the middle of the room. He looked back at Lily. She wore the pale purple robe with white trim. Her hair was tied with a matching band, revealing her ears and neck. The light from the window made her hair look a touch redder than usual and made her green eyes shine. He looked twice. She was the same face, the same silhouette against the darkening sky, and yet something about her felt altered. Lily caught his measuring gaze and smiled. She stepped forward, tilted her head, and said, bright and teasing, Professor Regulus? A corner of Regulus's mouth lifted. Student Lily. Chapter 246. Lily, a basic review. Lily stood in the middle of the classroom and asked expectantly, What are we practicing? Regulus didn't answer at once. He took a long look at her, not just at her face this time, but at her magical energy. Previously, he'd only glanced at her appearance. Now he was seeing how her magic flowed. One look told him everything. How to put it? A standard young witch. He knew well that raw magical energy didn't completely determine skill. Two witches with similar reserves could cast the same spell and still produce very different results. Some were more skilled, some practiced, some understood the spells deeply, others didn't. But past a certain point, strong magical energy was itself power. A witch with truly vast energy might not be trained for combat or relish fighting, but she wouldn't be weak. Only a few reached that level. They walked the path of magic itself, not just learned spells. Lily, he decided, was not there yet. She was a good, solid young witch, but still far from that rare level. Regulus withdrew the faint smile from his face and went serious. "We won't practice yet. First, a test." Lily blinked. Seeing his expression change, she immediately snapped into the right attitude. They were friends, but now he was her teacher. If the teacher got stern, the student should take it seriously. She straightened. "Okay." Regulus nodded. "Quick to focus. Good." Lily dropped her gaze briefly and almost smiled, but she suppressed it and looked up again, tone serious. "What do I do?" Regulus stepped back a few paces and adopted a relaxed stance. "Just a young witch, after all. Cast every spell you know, one by one, aimed at me." Lily hesitated. He had no wand in hand, no defensive stance, just standing there casually with no sign of wanting to defend himself. She opened her mouth to say something, but thought better of it. It would be pointless to try to disarm him. There was nothing to disarm. So, she raised her wand. Petrificus totalis, a gray light shot from the tip of her wand. It flew fast enough that in the blink of an eye, it was right in front of Regulus. Lily watched, expecting him to dodge, but instead he simply extended his hand, fingers splayed, palm facing outward, and closed it the instant the spell touched him. The gray light jumped and flared between his fingers like a trapped firefly, trying to escape. Regulus looked down at his hand as the ball of light twisted and shrank in his palm. He rubbed his thumb against his index finger. The spell collapsed into pinpricks of light that drifted away and vanished. He felt the spell. Her magical energy was stable, the spell's structure clear, no hesitation when she released it. It was commendable, even excellent for a young witch, but still the level of an excellent young witch. No matter how excellent, it was still not the deeper mastery he knew. He glanced at Lily. She stood opposite him with her mouth slightly open, eyes wide as if she'd seen something impossible. "Continue," Regulus said. "Cast all your spells once." Lily drew a breath, steadying herself, and put more force into each spell that followed. "Incendio!" Orange-red flames streamed from her wand, curling into a ribbon before spreading into a sheet in front of him. Regulus raised his hand and curled his fingers. The flames seemed to be drawn away from her wand and into his palm. They danced between his fingers, shrinking until they were the size of a fingernail, and then were extinguished without a trace. Exploding charm! The white light burst with a loud crack that echoed in the empty classroom. Regulus cupped his palm around the exploding mote as if it were a handful of water. It thudded a few times in his hand and then dissipated. "Avis!" A flock of silver birds erupted from her wand, flapping wildly as they struck him. He plucked one from the air. The rest froze mid-flight, as if pinned. He squeezed, and that bird shattered into sparks, followed by the rest. Petrificus totalis, stupefy, expelliarmus, the leglocker curse, impedimenta. Every spell she launched, he reached out, caught, crushed, and smothered. More than a dozen spells in a row. Lily stood there, wand raised, breath coming faster. Regulus finally let his hand fall. "Take a break," she exhaled, relief flooding her. His face had softened now, nothing like the look he'd worn while catching her spells. The tension eased, then returned. Those methods he'd used, she hadn't even heard of them. Catching a spell in your hand like a flying insect and crushing it out, what was that? She didn't know, but one thing was clear. The distance between them was greater than she'd thought. She stepped forward until she stood in front of him, voice still a little breathless. "How did you do that?" A faint smile curved Regulus's mouth. "The basics," Lily blinked. She remembered what he'd told her before. The basics of the basics. If this was the basics, then what had she been practicing? Not even the basics? She sounded a little wounded. "You said the basics last time. Is this what you meant?" Regulus only smiled. Yes, this was the basics. Whether he liked it or not, this was the foundation. It was manipulation of magical energy, a small trick, not even remotely advanced. He watched the expression on Lily's face. It said plainly, "You're joking, right?" It really is the basics, he said softly. Lily stared at him for 2 seconds, as if making sure he was not teasing. Seeing he wasn't, the idea of what basics meant in her mind shattered. She had thought basics meant being able to cast a spell cleanly, aim well, chant efficiently, just what she'd been practicing. Clearly, that wasn't the whole picture. After a moment, she asked, "Then what exactly do you mean by the basics?" "Manipulating magic," Regulus said. He explained, "Beyond spells, a witch can make many things happen directly with magical energy, without incantations or a wand. Your magic is part of you. It surrounds you and fills places you can and cannot see. You can make it do what you want. It's not casting a spell. It's making the magical energy itself become that effect." Lily frowned. "Isn't that just nonverbal and wandless magic?" "Nonverbal spells are formally taught in 3rd year, and wandless magic in 5th, Regulus said with a smile. "Have you been reading ahead?" Lily nodded. A flash of satisfaction crossed his eyes. She noticed and couldn't resist giving him a little pat. "Don't change the subject. I asked if this is nonverbal or wandless magic." "Nonverbal and wandless are the results, using willpower in place of incantations and a wand," Regulus said. "But that's the end product, not the process." Lily listened closely. "When you start practicing," he continued, "you have to visualize the spell clearly in your mind. Really think about what the effect looks like and what you want to achieve. Once you've practiced enough, you won't have to think the steps. As soon as the thought appears, the magic responds. That's because your magic has learned the path of that spell. You give it a direction and it follows. Magic manipulation is different. Nonverbal and wandless casting is the result. Manipulation is the process." Lily followed his words carefully. What he described wasn't in any textbook she'd read, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Regulus didn't elaborate further. This was getting deep, and for now, the immediate basics mattered more. He took another look at Lily, still processing, and in his mind added, "No, it's the basics of the basics. Let's not get lost in theory," he said gently. "Let's talk about your test results." Lily returned to the present. She was curious about the theory, but she could wait. "So why did you have me cast all those spells earlier? What were you testing?" Regulus's expression mixed seriousness with something like amusement. "You're an excellent young witch." Lily glared at him, saying nothing. He went on. However, still silent, she waited. The corner of his mouth curved. "There is quite a bit of room for improvement," Lily snorted. Regulus asked, "Are you rested?" She nodded quickly, voice sharp, "Yes." He stepped back 2 paces. Again. "This time I won't catch them. Watch how I cast them, then do the same." What followed gave Lily a new understanding of the word teach. Regulus could see the flow and condition of her magical energy as she worked. At a glance, he could tell what was wrong with a spell. Was the output strong enough? Was the structure stable? Was the rhythm from gathering to release correct? It was all there in his eyes. Professors often taught the motions, how to shape a spell, how to say the words, and left students to figure the rest out with practice. Regulus cut that long, uncertain process short. He told her exactly what to adjust, and she only had to correct it. Lily practiced with fierce concentration. Every flaw Regulus pointed out she fixed, and after each correction, she could feel the difference. And the difference was huge. Nearly 10 o'clock, Regulus glanced at the window. "That's it for today." Lily stopped, letting out a long breath. She looked tired, but her eyes were bright. Regulus smiled. "Not bad today." She smiled back and walked away from the window, tilting her head. "Will Professor Regulus teach me again tomorrow?" He let the corner of his mouth lift. "We'll see tomorrow." Lily rolled her eyes openly this time, not caring who saw. The second Wednesday of November dawned unusually bright, and the fine weather only made everything else seem more glaring. Snape was in a foul mood for no particular reason. If pressed, he might have blamed the sun. The bell rang and he left potions, heading for the dungeons. The corridor was crowded. Younger students ran past, their footsteps echoing off the stone. Older boys strolled in small groups, laughing and talking. Snape kept his head down and walked quickly. He didn't want to speak to anyone. He didn't want to be seen. Rounding the third-floor corner, the flow of students parted around him. James Potter had planted himself in the middle of the corridor, flipping his wand between his fingers. Sirius leaned against the wall with his hands in his pockets, looking perfectly idle. Lupin and Peter stood a few paces off. Lupin frowned. Peter hunched. Snape slowed only a fraction and kept going. "Snape!" James called after him, voice bright as if he'd found amusement in something. He glanced back to wink at Sirius, who grinned like an audience awaiting a performance. Snape pretended not to hear and kept walking. James stepped forward again and raised his voice deliberately. "Where'd you get that robe? Dumpster behind Spinner's End?" Snape stopped but didn't turn. His wand was already in his hand. "Did your mother alter it for you?" James added, scanning him and still twirling the wand. "It fits, though the material's a bit cheap." Snape's answer was a low hiss. "Move," James scoffed. "Or what?" Snape finally turned, flicked his wand, and the stupefy shot from the tip. James sidestepped. The spell grazed his shoulder and splashed off the wall. "Starting a fight," he mocked, pointing his wand and firing a jinx. Snape dodged, raised a shield charm, then lashed out with impedimenta at James's feet. James vaulted clear, stumbling slightly on the landing. Lupin watched, expression clouded. Peter shrank back without even drawing his wand. Sirius stayed against the wall, lounging, but his eyes never left Snape's wand. Snape struck again, and the spell clipped James on the shoulder, knocking him back 2 steps into the wall. James steadied himself, shook off the hit, and laughed. "Is that it?" he taunted, chin-tipped. Snape said nothing. His features were taut, his hand tightening on his wand. Sirius pushed off the wall, drew his wand, and shot a silent, gray spell from the side. Snape was facing James and didn't have time to turn. The spell struck him in the flank. He swayed but did not fall. His magical barrier faltered. He drew back, wild-eyed, and pointed his wand at Sirius. A red jet flew from it, but Sirius, still smiling that lazy, insolent smile, tilted his head and the curse glanced off. James pressed the advantage and sent 2 more hexes. One struck Snape in the chest, another grazed his arm. Snape's robe tore, exposed skin erupting in angry red. Gritting his teeth, he cast something that sent James sprawling to a knee. James rose at once and laughed louder. Forced toward the stone wall, back against the cold mortar, Snape's arm trembled. Sirius sent another spell that hit the floor near Snape's feet. Snape leapt aside, and James's next curse struck him in the back. He pitched forward and hit the floor face first. James put his wand away and chuckled. "Can't get up?" Snape tried to push himself up. His arms shook violently. He managed 2 attempts and collapsed back down. Lily came running from the other end of the corridor. She saw him on the floor, robe streaked with dust, hands braced on the stone, and crouched beside him. Severus. When Snape lifted his head, Lily's breath caught. His face had gone a gray so dark it was almost black. Something like filth seemed to seep out from under his skin. From brow to chin, his face looked dull and unwell. "Your face?" Lily began, then fell silent. Without answering, Snape scrambled to his feet, shrugged off her hand, and staggered toward the other end of the passage. Lily wheeled to face James, fury flushing her cheeks. "You!" "He started it," James said coolly, tucking his wand back into his pocket. "The 2 of you against 1, Lily said between clenched teeth. Sirius brushed his sleeves as if dusting them free. "Not the first time," he said lightly. Lily's anger flared, throat working, but she bit back whatever retort she wanted to make. Arguing would be useless. Lupin came over, patted James on the shoulder, and murmured, "Let's go." James glanced at Lily, said nothing further, shrugged, and left. Sirius followed. Peter slunk after them with his shoulders hunched. Lily stood for a moment watching the direction Snape had gone, then lowered her head and walked the other way. Snape pushed open the dormitory door. The common room was empty. A low fire burned in the hearth, its light throwing long, thin shadows across the stones. He stood in front of the round mirror. The face in the glass was gray, so dark it was almost black, the color sinking deeper near his neck. He rubbed his skin, but the darkness would not come away. His fingertips passed over it and left nothing. The gray seemed fused to his flesh. He stared for a long breath, then raised his wand. Reparo. Nothing. Finite incantatem. Still nothing. Scourgify. The face remained that murky gray-black. He laid his wand down and pressed his finger hard against the mirror, leaving a small fogged patch. He could identify the spells Potter had used. Standard jinxes, a leg locker, the langlock, things that, on paper, should not produce such an effect. The real worry was the silent spell from Black. He didn't know its nature. Or perhaps it was the combination of several spells that had produced this strange reaction. He clenched his fists until his knuckles ached. "Damn Potter," he hissed. "Damn Black." After a while, he remembered the whitening potion. It was simple to brew. The ingredients were available in the cupboards. He set about it with shaking hands, chopping roots with a blade that slipped twice before he slowed and forced the cuts. He tossed the components into the cauldron, stirred 3 times clockwise, 2 times counterclockwise, and reduced the flame. The firelight split his face into light and shadow as he watched the pale bubbles rise. At dinner, he did not go to the Great Hall. He sat on the edge of his bed, mirror in his lap, when Rabastan Lestrange entered without knocking and surveyed the room. At the sight of Snape, the corners of Rabastan's mouth soured as if he'd seen something unclean. Snape turned the mirror face down and met Rabastan's gaze, expression closed. Rabastan sat opposite, stretched his legs out, and leaned back. "I need you for something," he said. Snape watched him, impassive. Rabastan's eyes flicked to Snape's face. "What's wrong with your face?" he asked. The question darkened Snape's expression, but he gave no answer. Rabastan smirked with obvious disdain. "You know Lena Costa and Samuel Vance?" Snape's brow twitched. "2 half-bloods," he said flatly. "Humph," Rabastan snorted. "Go and find out why Black's protecting them. See if he's arranged anything for them." He added as an afterthought, almost an order, "Find out clearly. Tell me when you get back." Snape remained silent. Rabastan stood, looked down on him with curled lip. "You're all half-bloods too. You should get along." He brushed his sleeve as if shooing dust off his robe and moved to the door. At the frame, he turned back. "Don't let Black know I sent you." The door shut, and his footsteps faded. Snape sat very still on the edge of the bed, hands on his knees. The fire in the grate sputtered. The shadow on the wall shifted. He lifted the small round mirror and examined his face. The gray-black was unchanged, perhaps even deeper than before. He fetched the whitening potion. He sniffed it, then scooped a generous handful and rubbed it into his skin until his cheeks burned and his face was sore. When he set the mirror up again, his face was white, too white, unnaturally so. He stared at that pallid reflection a long moment, set the mirror down, pulled a hooded robe from the cupboard, and drew the hood up low over his brow, so half his face was concealed. He opened the door and slipped out. Most of the corridor was empty now. The Great Hall had swallowed the majority of students. Snape moved toward the library, head down, steps light as if afraid of making a sound. He stopped at a dim corner, and from there could just see the library door. The light was softer where he stood, and anything seen from the bright side would be hard to make out. He leaned against the wall, hood shadowing his face, and waited. Half an hour later, someone came out of the direction of the Great Hall. Not Sirius, but his less odious brother, Regulus Black. Snape stepped out of the shadows. "Black," he said flatly. Only a careful ear might have detected the strain underneath. Regulus halted and turned. "Snapey." He gave Snape's face a second look and flinched, as if he had seen something repulsive. His expression tightened in undisguised disgust. "Snape, why is your face so dark?" Regulus studied Snape's face for a long moment. The wizarding world had practiced discrimination for centuries, and its target was always the same: Muggleborns. That was the only criterion that mattered. The Shacklebolts, one of the Sacred 28, had been entered in the Pureblood Directory in the 1930s and officially recognized as pureblood. They had unmistakable African roots, yet they still prospered in pureblood society. In some circles, their exotic origin was almost regarded as an aristocratic curiosity. Regulus had no quarrel with that. People of talent could make a place their own. If they liked somewhere, they settled there, and over generations they became locals. The Shacklebolts' origin was hazy. No one could say exactly when they arrived in Britain or how they'd worked their way into the Sacred 28 among so many white families. But the Directory and the Ministry accepted them, and there were no records of Muggle marriages in their tree. Pure blood, end of story. The Boots were also black and listed in the Directory, so why argue? The wizarding world had always been more varied than it pretended, and as long as the ancestry was clean enough, skin color rarely came up. Regulus's gaze swept back to Snape. The prince name had fallen on hard times, but it was still an old name. Eileen Prince had married a muggle and produced this one. He was a half-blood, but the prince blood ran in him. That much was indisputable. What bothered Regulus was that while there were black wizards in Britain and they did well for themselves, he had never seen a pure-blood white family with no African lineage suddenly produce a black child. Color prejudice wasn't the point. It was the unprecedentedness of it. He looked closer. Something had been smeared on Snape's face, some kind of potion. To an ordinary student, the skin might have only looked unpleasantly pale, but Regulus's magic perception followed the layers beneath. There was gray across the forehead and cheekbones, darkening as it flowed down until the chin was almost pitch black. It was grotesque. Regulus pulled his eyes away. Snape stood motionless in the dim corridor, hood drawn, brows knitted, lips a tight line. He must have stood in front of a mirror in his dormitory for who knew how long, been examined by Rabastan, then retreated to the corridor to wait. The frustration in him didn't rise or sink. It lodged like a stone in his chest, indistinctly uncomfortable. Earlier, Lestrange had stepped back with an expression that Snape couldn't quite classify. Was it an insult? Snape couldn't say. The look he had received from the Lestrange was different from the usual contempt he knew. Some people looked down on him because of rankable things, family, blood, clothes. Everything could be stacked to place a man beneath another. Lestrange did that. Black's look was different. In his presence, the Black's ancient lineage made those standards irrelevant. The family tree was so pure it belonged to another order of things. Yet when Black had taken a step back now, it was a simple recoil, focused on Snape's current state and the disarray of his clothing. There was more than judgment there, distaste. Thinking of Sirius, a Black who had cast the spell that had altered his appearance before, darkened Snape's mood. The Black standing before him now made him think of that same kind of malice. Regulus, hood shadowing his face, watched Snape's expression flicker. He suspected someone had tampered with him. It explained the uncanny state. There was a private relief in that. If Snape hadn't become like this by choice, then it could be treated as an incident rather than a social truth to swallow. The prince bloodline might make a dark wizard of him, Regulus thought, but it wouldn't make him black. Regulus raised a finger and pointed. Snape swayed, hand going for his pocket in a reflex. He hesitated, then stopped himself. If Black intended to attack, he wouldn't do it here, and there was no reason to escalate. Snape relaxed his hand away from his pocket and waited. Something shifted under his skin, a subtle unweaving of whatever charm had been applied. Regulus's voice, less tense now, said, "Wipe your face." Snape produced his wand and tapped his cheeks. The whitening potion smeared across his skin vanished. He flicked the wand again, and a thin mist condensed at the tip, forming a mirror-like surface in midair. He leaned close and examined himself. Sallow, ordinary. He lowered his head, voice dry. "Thank you." Regulus only nodded. Snape standing hooded in a corridor at this hour, with his face like that, meant trouble. Snape looked at Regulus for a heartbeat, then away toward the stone wall, his tone leveling. "Tonight, Rabastan Lestrange came to find me. He wanted me to discover why Black is protecting Lena Costa and Samuel Vance, and whether you've arranged anything for them." Regulus didn't comment, just inclined his head. Snape continued, "He told me to come back and tell him what I'd found." He hesitated, then added, "He said I was not to let you know he sent me." He shut his mouth and waited for a reaction. Regulus's face betrayed nothing. He only said, "Understood." The corridor was silent for a long moment, torchlight flickering across the stone. Rabastan Lestrange had been badly handled by Avery, Alex, and Hermes the year before. Left in such a state, he'd spent the holidays in the hospital wing. On his own, he was nothing to be feared, but the timing of his appearance mattered. Lestrange was a name of weight among the purebloods and a core family on Voldemort's side. Bella had married Rodolphus, making Rabastan her brother-in-law. Rabastan acting now could only mean he was reporting back to her. That was enough to be dangerous. If Regulus moved directly against Rabastan, there would be more than a school spat. It would be Black versus Lestrange, a quarrel between two great houses that could explode beyond their control. Making Rabastan act first was key. Lena and Samuel were under Regulus's protection. If Rabastan made a move, Regulus would have grounds to retaliate. It was a plausible, escalatable justification. Rabastan was no genius. Sending Snape to spy and then being betrayed by Snape fit the man. Even if Rabastan truly was acting for Bella, Regulus could present it as a Lestrange provocation. The logic was simple and serviceable, and since Rabastan had shown his hand, it would be foolish not to use him as leverage. Regulus asked calmly, "Why didn't you do what he asked?" Snape said nothing, eyes dropping. Regulus waited, and when no answer came, he didn't press. He could make a fair guess. The Lestranges despised half-bloods. A man like Snape had no standing in their eyes. Regulus looked at him and said, "Rosier will contact you." Snape started. He'd come to Black instinctively to report and expected some acknowledgement, maybe an appropriate reward. He had not expected Rosier to be sent. Alex Rosier was a known member of Black's inner circle. Everyone in Slytherin knew it, Snape included, and Rosier was the one responsible for the two half-bloods, Costa and Vance. The message was clear. Regulus intended to use Rosier in whatever response he made to Rabastan, possibly involving the Lestranges. It was a way to draw Snape in, to tie him more closely to Black's side. Snape looked up at Regulus, eyes troubled and suddenly resolute. Regulus said nothing more. The torches cracked, their shadows moving on the stone. Snape stood long enough to let his thoughts settle. He had already come and told. In doing so, he had taken a side, though he had not quite admitted that to himself until now. Regulus was simply making the consequences explicit. Snape lowered his head and nodded. Regulus acknowledged him with a nod in return, then turned and pushed open the library door. The hinges groaned as the door swung shut behind him. Snape stood watching the closed door for a while, then turned and walked toward the other end of the corridor. With the choice made, a peculiar relief eased his chest. His face had returned to normal. He no longer had to hide in corridors. The great hall hadn't emptied yet, and hunger pushed him forwards. He quickened his pace, to eat and to think. Chapter 249, Precise Identity Positioning. Regulus wasn't in a hurry to make concrete moves. He didn't plan to do it all himself. He didn't have many people around him, but each person needed to be ready for use. Since his speech in the common room, Avery had developed a strange new habit. He'd begun thinking one step ahead, analyzing situations from a particular, almost official perspective. He was still imitating, perhaps his father, perhaps the ministry officials he'd watched. Sometimes he'd put on airs. His tone, his pauses, even the way he held his cup looked like someone at a meeting. Regulus found it amusing. The imitation was immature. Occasionally the tone came off like a teenager trying too hard, but the direction was right. Avery was growing into the public face Regulus had always intended him to be, the spokesperson, the young scion who could stand before a crowd and command attention. As the young master of House Casbert, Avery would sooner or later need to move comfortably in pure-blood circles. It was good he was catching on early. Alex was different. Over a year ago, he had been the kind of boy who barely dared speak above a whisper in the dormitory, terrified of drawing attention. Then they went into the astronomy tower. Looking back, that incident had been serious. The cursed chamber, that thing. They had nearly lost Hermes, and Regulus himself had been forced to endure it for a while. It would have been dangerous even for a fully trained witch or wizard. Yet Alex had gone in and come out intact. People change when they survive real crises. Add more than a year of practicing magic, and his level had risen considerably. He wasn't brilliantly talented, but he was obedient and willing to work. His progress was real. When power accumulates, a person's temperament changes. Confidence built by practice can't be faked. Hermes was an outlier. Since fully joining this small circle, he had basically decided to devote his brain to researching magic, leaving everything else to Regulus. Outside his own studies in the dark arts, he rarely taxed his mind. He crammed what he needed for exams, good enough grades, and otherwise spent his days brooding over darker matters. If Regulus made an arrangement, Hermes followed without questioning or offering alternatives. It was as if he thought, as long as Regulus handled the planning, he could save his brain power for spell work. But his talent was real. Among the lower years, his raw power stood on another level. Older students might know more spells or possess greater control, but in an all-out fight, Regulus believed Hermes could take several of them down. His behavior made it easy to think he'd traded intelligence for strength, but maybe that was simply his way of positioning himself. Then there was Severus Snape. Regulus had forced him into a choice with a single, carefully placed sentence. By telling Rabastan Lestrange to find Snape, Regulus had made Snape decide whether to align with Black or Lestrange. There was no middle ground. Snape could have left, pretended it had never happened, tried to revert to being a Slytherin pariah. Regulus would not have stopped him. He understood Snape better than Snape did himself. In Regulus's eyes, Snape was a high-quality asset, talented, useful. In their first year, he had even stopped James Potter from cornering Snape. Afterwards, Snape supplied intelligence, Regulus paid him, and recommended him to Slughorn as an assistant. Those moves had put Snape in Regulus's sphere. They weren't friends so much as a functional superior-subordinate relationship based on mutual exchange. Snape might imagine them collaborators, but he also knew that if Regulus let him go, Lestrange would not. Men like Rabastan would scorn his background while forcing him to act. With contempt on one side and coercion on the other, there was little room to resist. So the real question wasn't which side to pick, so much as whether Snape had that sliver of dignity he wouldn't let be stamped out. Inferiority and pride grew from the same root in him. Inferiority because of blood, pride because of talent. He was hypersensitive, paranoid about slights, but shrewd enough to judge advantages. With Rabastan, he would get nothing but insults. With Regulus, he was at least treated like a human being, with clear, unambiguous returns. For Snape, that was the best deal he could find in Slytherin. Choosing the black side was obvious. He lowered his head and nodded. Regulus reviewed these people in his mind. There weren't many of them, but they were enough. 8 p.m., the room of requirement. Regulus laid out the evening's events in a flat, objective tone. Rabastan had sought out Snape. Snape had come to him. This was what had been said. He recounted facts in order, no commentary. "What are we waiting for?" Avery asked, already reaching into his pocket for his wand. "Let's go straight to him. He moved first. We should strike back." Regulus glanced at him. Avery's reasoning was simple. Rabastan had sent Snape to spy on Regulus's people, provocation, and provocations should be met with a counterstrike. He hadn't thought about what might follow, whether Lestrange would ultimately be pulled in, whether his father's house would have to answer for him. At Avery's age, a fight between young scions was just that, a juvenile conflict. How could children's squabbles escalate to family warfare? It was only a brawl. There was no need to involve his father's methods. Alex, sitting nearby, frowned. "Should we have Lena and Samuel lay low for a while?" He spoke hesitantly. Keela Novels, his portable stall, over 10,000 volumes, Lestrange is targeting them. If they're not around, Lestrange won't have a target. Alex knew his role without being told. After running errands, passing messages, and keeping track of movements, he understood his place, the one who kept people together and things running smoothly. He liked it, safe, steady, not on the front lines, but central. Now that Lestrange had become involved, his instinct was to avoid risk. Hermes leaned against the oak door, silent, eyes on the floor as if drifting. Dark mist seemed to rise from his shoulders and coil through the air. His eyelids drooped, only occasionally lifting to reveal a faint glow. Regulus smiled. Hermes usually refused to apply his mind to anything but magic, waiting for Regulus to arrange everything. Yet now he was thinking, though in his own way. Others considered how to manage the scene or manage fallout. Hermes thought about how to take people down. It was useful thinking. "My point is, let Lestrange make the first move." Avery froze. Alex looked up. Hermes lifted his eyelids. "Costa and Vance don't need to be hidden," Regulus said. "They'll show up as usual, and Lestrange will go looking for them. If he moves—" He paused and then finished, "we can let them take a little punishment." Alex went quiet, stunned. He wanted to ask something. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Regulus never did anything without a reason. He thought it over and nodded slowly, frowning as he tried to gauge the balance. Let Lena and Samuel be bait? Would they be frightened? Would they really get hurt? Regulus said, "A little punishment." But how little was enough? Too little, and it would sabotage the plan. Too much, and he couldn't bear it. He needed a way to make Lestrange feel victorious while keeping Lena and Samuel essentially unharmed. Avery understood quickly. If Lestrange moved first, the clash wouldn't be started by Regulus. A straight fight between scions could be chalked up to youthful tempers, detentions, a few point deductions, maybe a stirring among prefects. But if Rabistan attacked Costa and Vance first, it became different. A Lestrange initiated provocation against people under Black's protection. That crossed a line into family business. House Casbert might not be as powerful as House Black, but it was one of the Sacred 28. Head-to-head with Lestrange, his father's side, Avery thought of something his father had once said: "The people who stand with you through trouble are the ones you can truly count on." The astronomy tower had bound them together. They should keep that bond. He sat back, considered the strategy, then turned to Alex. "We have to make Lestrange believe there's an opportunity before he'll make his move." Alex, slipping into his role, supplied details. "Lena and Samuel have a few times when they're alone lately. After potions, the corridor from the dungeons back to the dorms is thinly populated. The corner on the 3rd floor, someone was cornered there today." "Then we'll use that stretch," Avery said. "Make sure Rabistan knows they'll be alone then. If he's going to act, he'll pick that moment." "How do we get that message to him?" Alex asked. "Let him overhear it," Avery said. "Say it somewhere where his people will be present." Alex was quiet for a moment, voice low. "But they'll really be the ones to suffer." Avery curled his lip and looked away. Alex understood. This was decided. Regulus had said, "Let them take a little punishment," and that settled it. His hesitation wouldn't change anything, but it left him uneasy. Lena was clever and Samuel earnest, the two he dealt with most. It was hard enough for them in Slytherin without being sent into danger on purpose. He swallowed the feeling and braced his voice with determination. "I'll arrange it." The plan expanded, one idea becoming 2, then 4, their circles widening and the details growing bolder. Regulus listened without interrupting. He didn't correct them about what Lestrange truly sought. Rabistan wasn't wholly stupid. He wouldn't personally go cornering someone without thinking, but Regulus let them think, plot, and piece the plan together. Even if their direction was slightly off, the process mattered. Last year, they'd been dragged in passively. This time they were standing together, shaping a response. That kind of experience was rare. He glanced at Hermes. The other's eyes had brightened, but he had stayed out of the debate, thinking on his own. Then he cut in, halting Avery mid-sentence. "Alex." Alex turned immediately. "Snape's part of this," Hermes said. "Bring him into the plan. As for Costa and Vance, tell them the situation and let them decide." Avery's mouth set in a tight line and he kept silent. Alex blinked, then nodded. "Understood." Regulus added one more instruction. "Keep close watch. Don't let anything major go wrong." He stood and moved to his desk, pushing the door open. Voices rose behind him. Avery argued a detail with kinetic energy, Alex's voice softer but persistent. They refined the plan again and again. Hermes said only one thing before he fell silent. "Tell me when you've finished. I'll be the one to act." Regulus sat back down in the small room. It wasn't much. Let them handle it. Chapter 250. Hogwarts. No, early morning, astronomy tower. The clouds were thin and the moon hung bright and round, its light turning the stones atop the tower a ghostly white. The black lake lay in the distance, its surface broken into fine ripples. A sheet of moonlight slid across it, shifting with the wind. The forbidden forest was swallowed by the night, its edges blurred into shadow so that only a dark silhouette remained. Regulus stood on the same stone slab where Dumbledore had set him down the last time, the place where the astronomy tower met the sky. Dumbledore had told him then that after he returned, he could try letting his Patronus travel through the castle. It should work. He had remembered the words, but he hadn't yet tried. Light source magic had consumed most of his energy recently, trips to the Forbidden Forest to run experiments with Baruch, then long nights of returning to think about the convergence of light and the encapsulation of information, so this had been put off. Now that light source magic had reached a milestone, he planned to find that other person again to run new tests, but first he would deal with this matter. He breathed in deeply. The night wind swept through the tower's embrasures, cold but not biting. November at Hogwarts had not yet reached its coldest, and the breeze carried a clean chill that slapped his robes against his legs. Silver-white light gathered at his chest, condensing into a shape of starlight, first one wing, then the head, then the other wing. His Patronus took form, the starry sky kite. its feathers edged with a fine silver radiance that glowed softly in the night. The kite landed on his shoulder and shook its wings, silver light rippling from feather tip to tail. It cocked its head at him, then lifted off and circled once above his head. It cried out, a clear, piercing note that hung a moment over the open tower before the wind scattered it. It was content. Regulus could feel it. It wasn't a complex emotion, only the small comfort of coming out for air. He raised his chin and nodded toward the castle. Try it. The starry sky kite flew toward the castle. It glided down at an angle, wings half folded as its speed increased, then tucked its wings tight and straightened its body. The silver light along its form drew into a single line, reaching forward as though to carve a passage through the air. The passage did not open. Space itself tightened ahead of it. The air became viscous, hard. The kite, unable to stop, slammed into that invisible barrier. A force seized it from all directions and flung it backward. It righted itself and tried again, this time from a different direction and at a faster speed. Rushing to the same point, the force grabbed it and pushed it back once more. High altitude, low approaches, the castle's flank. No matter how it tried, the result was the same. Each time it reached that invisible boundary, space constricted and repelled it. The kite hovered midair with wings spread, seeming to consider. After a moment, it made one last attempt, faster than before. Silver light burst as its whole body elongated into a streak of white, plunging forward. The force hit even harder, seizing tighter and pushing further. It was bounced away, flipping twice before stabilizing. It returned to Regulus's shoulder, landed on his chest, and tucked its head under a wing, showing only the tip of its beak, a little affronted at being rejected. Regulus reached out and touched its wing. Flying was no problem. The Patronus could circle the tower, dive and pull out. Any aerial maneuver was fine. But the moment it tried to travel through space as a passage, space itself tightened. Space was refusing. He stared at the castle. When Dumbledore had said those words, it had sounded like permission granted by the headmaster, or simply a statement that the Patronus itself could pass through the castle's wards. Since it had failed, he had to rule out the possibility that the old man had been joking. Dumbledore did like to tease. He sometimes wore a smile, offered a comment that made one mull for half a day, then walked off with his hands clasped behind his back, leaving them bewildered. He was not one to affect heirs. He had a curiosity for new things and liked seeing people puzzled until they had a sudden understanding. But Dumbledore was more than that. He was the greatest white wizard of the century and the headmaster of Hogwarts. When he meant to instruct, he did not waste words, nor would he say, "It should work," merely as a jest to send someone on a needless errand. If he had said it, it was guidance, oblique in his usual way, but meaningful. The old man was a riddler. Regulus actually liked the method. Figuring things out himself was far more engaging than being told the answer. So what had Dumbledore wanted him to understand? He looked down at the Patronus on his shoulder. Its silver light had dimmed. It had tucked its head and looked faintly disgruntled. Its meaning was plain. I could, but I was not allowed. The Patronus's travel relied on invitation. When it opened a passage, it wasn't forging a new tunnel, but finding a path already present in space and asking space to cooperate. Its relationship with space was one of resonance and consent, not force. That was its talent, and his. What the starry sky could not do, he could not do either. But outside the castle, in Hogsmeade, in Germany, it had been able to pass. Regulus remembered earlier attempts to grate his own signature magic into the space of Hogwarts. He had tried many times and failed. Before, he'd blamed technique or lack of will. Now, seeing the Patronus bounced back, he considered another explanation. Hogwarts' space simply would not cooperate. This was not a technical limitation, but an attitude. The Patronus's invitation was refused, and his own magic had been refused as well. It was no coincidence. The castle's space had a will. If it disagreed, nothing passed. He looked again at the stones underfoot and at the dark silhouette of the castle. Hogwarts is alive. This thought had come to him before, but previously he'd taken it as a figure of speech. Stairs that altered their direction, doors that decided whether to open, rooms that shifted their positions. Those were the enchantments left by the founders. But what if those were not mere set spells? What if they were the castle's manner of being alive? 1,000 years of architecture, 1,000 years of enchantments, 1,000 years of students coming and going. Those lives and spells had left traces, giving the castle habits, judgments, a temper. When it did not want someone inside, stairs might loop extra turns, doors would clamp shut, and corridors would stretch twice as long as usual. Considered this way, the Patronus being repelled made sense. It wasn't that the Patronus lacked speed or strength, it was the castle saying, no. What then had Dumbledore wanted him to try? Regulus followed the thought. Perhaps Dumbledore wanted him to realize the castle's sentience. He understood that now. The castle had its own will and judgment, and whether his enchantments could take hold depended on its consent. Or perhaps Dumbledore wanted him to establish a relationship with the castle. The Patronus's passage was an invitation. Integrating his magic into Hogwarts would be something deeper. If the castle never nodded, neither could happen. But if one day it did nod, the consequences would be more than a simple passage. It might mean the castle had recognized him and was willing to incorporate his magic into its own system. The words that turned over in his mind: protection, Hogwarts is alive, the Patronus's invitation, a cooperative relationship, began to point towards something whose edges he could feel but not yet grasp. He couldn't solve it now. If he couldn't, he would simply come and try often. A relationship of cooperation rarely succeeds at a single attempt. One must show sincerity and patience until the other feels that this person is truly all right and not rash. Perhaps one day the castle would deem him acceptable and let him in. He withdrew his thoughts. All right, he said to the Patronus. That's enough for tonight. The starry sky kite folded its wings, settled back on his chest, and its silver light drew in. Regulus glanced toward the headmaster's office, the West Tower's topmost rooms, and saw a few windows still lit. Still awake at this hour, who knew what the old man was doing? He turned away, stepped from the embrasure, and for a moment his body fell as a gust rose from below, tugging his robes. He caught himself and took off toward the forbidden forest, moving at an unhurried pace. The clouds drifted slowly overhead, moonlight breaking through in patches. The castle shrank behind him, the window lights dwindling to tiny points. He let the wind carry him and felt oddly comfortable. In the headmaster's office, Dumbledore stood by the window, wrapped in that deep purple dressing gown, embroidered with silver stars, his hair and beard loose. He watched the figure moving toward the forbidden forest and smiled. To the forbidden forest again, he observed. On a nearby stand, Fawkes peered out from under a wing, his golden plumage catching the hearthlight. He turned his head to look at Dumbledore, then followed his gaze out the window. Don't be in a hurry, he'll come to you, Dumbledore said gently. You must be patient. That lad sometimes gets busy and loses track of time. Fawkes let out a cry as if replying, but it sounded indifferent. That attitude of yours, Dumbledore shook his head. Don't be like that when he comes. Fawkes cocked his head, ruffled his wings once, then tucked his head back into his feathers, leaving one eye visible. Dumbledore laughed softly and moved to the center of the room. Some portraits on the walls dozed, some murmured quietly within their frames. A few shifted to peer at him and then pretended not to have noticed. Tinkering with that black boy again? A shrill voice called from the right. Dilys Derwent leaned in her frame with an open book in hand, peering over the top of the pages. Dumbledore smiled, but did not answer. You let him fly around the astronomy tower in the middle of the night just to see whether he can pass through walls? Everard Cragg's voice added with a tone of disapproval. The third headmaster's white hair and stern face peered at Dumbledore. He needs to know where the barrier is, Dumbledore replied casually. Know where the barrier is? Cragg's voice sharpened. And does he know now? Soon, Dumbledore said. Cragg studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. In the topmost frame, Phineas Nigellus Black straightened from his chair, wearing a green robe with a silver cravat tied neatly. His gaze fixed on Dumbledore. Have you really thought this through? He asked. The office fell still. Derwent closed her book. Cragg raised his head, and even the dozing portraits stirred. Dumbledore lifted his cup of hot cocoa, took a sip, and delayed his answer. 1,000-year-old castle, Phineas continued. Albus, do you truly believe that, child? He hesitated, then asked again, Have you thought it through? An old man in a corner frame took up the tone with thin sarcasm. Phineas, surely it isn't merely because his name is Black that you— Phineas ignored him and kept his gaze on Dumbledore. From another frame, a sneer drifted. He's of your house of Black. Of course you hope he can take it on. Phineas remained unbothered, continuing to study Dumbledore. A Patronus is a reflection of the soul, Dumbledore said slowly. His Patronus is the starry sky kite. You know the temperament of that bird. I have seen it. It is not something trained. It is his own. Phineas's painted finger tapped the frame edge, though it made no sound. He fell quiet for a long time, finally saying only, "There is still plenty of time." "Yes, there is still plenty of time," Dumbledore agreed, setting his cup down. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were distant. "The castle will choose for itself." Phineas looked at him long and hard. In those eyes, eyes that bore a likeness to Regulus's, some deep feeling churned. Dumbledore said no more, but went back to the window and rested his hands on the sill, looking out. Beyond, the treetops of the Forbidden Forest lay swallowed in black night, hiding whatever lay within, but that boy was somewhere in there. The castle's stones stood silent in the night wind. 1,000 years on, it remained itself. Fawkes lifted from the stand and settled on Dumbledore's shoulder. "Only when it chooses," Dumbledore whispered, "will it count." Chapter 251, Regulus, I'm Not Clean Anymore. Regulus landed at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Hagrid's hut was dark. The big dog Flossie in the pumpkin patch lay curled in her kennel, ears lifting once and drooping again. He apparated directly. In the next instant, his feet touched the sticky velvet cushion inside the nest at the center of the hollow. As he raised his head, his magic perception flared, and he saw something he should not have seen. In the clearing, Aragog and Mozag were entwined, their 16 legs overlapping. They were mating. Aragog loomed much larger than Mozag, his deep black carapace pressed onto her gray-brown abdomen. Two of his thick forelegs clamped around her. The hard spikes at their tips sunk deep into the soft membrane at the edge of her abdominal armor, hooked in place. Mozag let out a long, drawn hiss. The tail end of the sound rose like a tear being opened from the inside. The hiss ran along the spider silk that crisscrossed the hollow. Even the small spiders nearby stopped moving, crouched motionless, chelicerae tucked under their cephalothoraxes, legs folded as if in reverence. Aragog's rhythm quickened. Mozag's hissing grew louder. Her abdomen rose and swelled, so the carapace stretched nearly translucent, and something churned beneath it. Mucus seeped from gaps in the armor, trailed down the silk, and formed a filthy puddle on the ground. A few little spiders crawled out of the shadows to crowd around it, pressing their chelicerae into the pool and licking. Their abdomens bunched up, their carapaces stained the same murk. Regulus's magic perception was still on, and the assault hit him more on a magical level than a visual one. There was a predator's aura fused with reproductive instinct, intense, primitive, laced with the dark quality unique to an acromantula's vitality bloom. The oppressive immediacy of a living being utterly surrendering to its most basic need pressed in on him as if someone had shoved his face into it. Mozag's magic fluctuated wildly in waves. Aragog's pressed on it, crushing and shaping it, then letting it swell again. For 2 seconds, Regulus stood stunned. He was only 12. Where had he ever seen this? Even though his soul contained another life's memories, even though those memories held all manner of things, the scene still exceeded his comprehension. He felt his own magic recoil. His spirit had been tainted. His senses felt violated. He was not clean anymore. He apparated again and vanished. A moment later, he stood on a rock at the rim of the hollow, back to the nest, facing the deeper dark of the Forbidden Forest. There were no trees immediately around the hollow. The moon hung pallid in the sky and mist drifted on the breeze, but they felt distant, unreal. He drew a long breath, trying to calm the nausea and the churning under his ribs. It did not subside. He tried again. It stayed. The residue of the magic perception clung in his head, the details so vivid they made him sick. He closed his eyes, intending to use occlumency, to strip the memory from his surface consciousness, lock it in a sealed quarantine in his mind, and forget it. Technically, it would be easy. His current mental strength made such closure trivial, but he did not act at once. A thought cut through him. That impact on his spirit came from the information itself, from what the image conveyed. No one had attacked him. The image had done the damage alone. It had made him uncomfortable, nauseous, physically ill, nothing more. So what if some piece of information could carry something that destroyed sanity? If so, it would not be mere information but a weapon. It would need no spells, no clash of magic, no active intrusions or passive defenses. Merely exposure would be enough. Seeing it, hearing it, perceiving it, one would collapse under its own understanding. He let the idea run deeper. Could there exist a concept that by itself caused anyone who encountered it to break? You would not need to see it directly, nor be attacked by it. Simply knowing of its existence, the act of comprehending it, would shred a person's rational structure. Human minds have limits. Things within those limits can be processed, things beyond them exceed what the mind can bear. On contact, sanity would crumble before fear could form. Fear is still a reaction. Collapse would come first. A weapon like that would be indefensible. Occlumency could block active intrusion, but it could not guard against the dissolution of reason once an idea had entered one's field of view. Regulus thought of his light source magic. Light carries information. He had proven that. If he could encode such information into light, he could stand in one place and do nothing. The moment the light reflected from him, the encoded content would be transmitted. Everyone who saw him would receive it, and all would collapse or go mad simultaneously. The thought was extreme. It might be feasible, but there was no sample of information like that to work from. The spider mating he had just witnessed made a person sick, but it was far from a sanity-destroying concept. Still, even making people recoil had uses. Used properly, it could be powerful. He forced the memory into his quarantine, labeled it, sealed it, and cataloged it as material for future output. Then he steadied himself and reorganized his thoughts. He had business tonight. Aragog had already crawled out of the nest. His silhouette loomed in the mist, 8 legs landing with steady thuds that sent faint tremors through the ground. He stopped a few paces from Regulus. The top row of eyes gleamed a pearly white in the night. After a pause, Aragog spoke, his voice rough and low as ever. "You come at an inconvenient time." Regulus kept his back to the nest and did not answer. Aragog's chelicera opened and closed with a clicking sound. He sounded genuinely puzzled, utterly biological in his bewilderment. "Reproduction is necessary for the colony's continuation. Mozag is in good condition this year. That is a boon. Why do you want to leave?" Regulus turned slightly to look at him. Aragog lay with his legs tucked to his sides, his abdomen rising and falling. His top row of eyes held no mockery, only a plain, natural incomprehension. He was asking seriously. Regulus said in a measured voice, "I felt like an intruder." After a long beat, Regulus asked, "You spiders don't care about being watched?" He had never known whether creatures like these tried to hide such things. Perhaps Aragog's colony was peculiar, or perhaps Hagrid had raised them without modesty. Aragog's answer was immediate and simple. "Care about what? Mating? Reproduction? Do you wizards not mate?" "We do," Regulus replied. "Do you not let others watch when you mate?" Aragog asked. There was something almost sage-like in the question. Regulus considered it seriously. "Usually we don't." He had never actually seen wizards mate either, and he was fairly sure they did not allow spectators. Or perhaps some did. He pushed the thought aside. "Carry on," he said. "I'm looking for Baruch." Aragog made a short clicking sound. From deep within the nest, another voice answered, slightly higher-pitched and brisk. Aragog turned and crawled back into the shadows. His legs moved with the measured sway of his bulk. His chelicerae made low rumbling noises as he vanished through the nest's mouth. Baruch emerged soon after, scuttling quickly, bits of velvet clinging to his carapace. He stopped before Regulus, his front half leaning forward, the tips of his foremost legs tapping the rock. Regulus watched the greeting and raised one hand in return. Baruch's 8 eyes were fixed on him. He lifted and lowered his front legs in an eager salute. Regulus relaxed his magic perception and studied him. Baruch's magic was unchanged, spiderish, primitive, predatory, and dark, with strong racial characteristics, but layered over it were clear emotions, anticipation, curiosity, excitement, and a closeness Regulus could not quite name. "Still want that feeling from last time?" Regulus asked. Baruch clicked rapidly. "That, very strong." His forelegs beat twice on the rock in an urgent rhythm. "Want to experience." Regulus raised his hand and a small ball of silvery white light appeared at his fingertips. This time, he tuned the light not to arrogance or disdain, but to curiosity and eager invitation. The glow washed over Baruch. The spider stiffened for a moment and then responded, briefly, far shorter than before, his reaction over in less than 2 seconds. He wasn't confused this time. He spun twice in place, his front legs drumming a rapid, staccato rhythm on the stone, as if reliving something. Then he lifted his head and emitted a flurry of urgent clicks. Regulus could not parse the sounds exactly, but he understood the message well enough. Do it again. Regulus stopped shining the light. Baruch paused, 8 eyes fixed on him. It lifted a front leg, put it down, lifted it again, and put it down once more. For some reason, Regulus thought it looked like a puppy. He twitched the corner of his mouth, then asked, "Do you want the real thing?" Baruch was silent for a moment, its chelicerae opening and closing in a soft clicking. Want. Last time, the feeling faded away. There was something indescribable in the cadence of the clicks. "Father Aragog, stronger than me, I didn't change at all." Regulus asked again. "You knew the last time was fake?" "I knew." Baruch tapped a front leg on the ground. "Want, real. Don't want, fake." A spider, temporarily infused with arrogance by light source magic, had awakened an ambition. The thought was odd, but inexplicably true. Regulus considered for a moment. "Show me what you can do now, to what extent?" Baruch stepped back a few paces. Then all 8 legs pushed off the rock at once, and it shot forward so fast it blurred in the mist. It ran back, reared up, and clamped its chelicerae onto a nearby rock about half its body size. With a sudden pull, the rock shattered into pieces. Baruch spun a strand of silk from its abdomen. It flew 40 meters to a tree trunk, stuck, tightened, and catapulted the spider over the gap. It landed and looked back at Regulus, clicking its chelicerae twice as if to say, "See?" Then it hurried toward the nest and slipped inside. Regulus waited. Minutes later, Baruch dragged a deer out of the nest. It wasn't large, its back legs still kicked. Baruch hauled it to the front of the rock, released its grip, stepped back. The deer thrashed twice but couldn't rise. Baruch leaned in, opened its mouth parts, and bit a hind leg. Venom injected, the deer's muscles seized and lost control in an instant, paralysis spreading forward from the hindquarters. The forelegs paddled and then stopped. The body went limp, eyes open but pupils wide. From bite to death, it was less than a second. Regulus nodded. Not bad. Speed, strength, silk range. Among peers its size and age, Baruch's physical stats were impressive. The venom acted almost instantaneously, but the delivery was primitive, simple biting, nothing more. Still, Baruch was an unexpectedly useful subject. It was cooperative and, more importantly, provided clear feedback on its state. For the next phase of his light source magic experiments, Regulus needed a living subject that could be studied over time and would accept repeated interventions. Baruch actually enjoyed being worked on. Sentient creatures generally hated having their minds tampered with. This one did not. That made it valuable. What interested him most was the possibility. If Baruch could be made significantly stronger, if it could break through the Acromantula's racial limitations, what would that look like? The Acromantula hive mind was strong. The colony naturally obeyed its leader. If one spider grew powerful enough, could it challenge Aragog? A spider coup. But before that, Regulus needed to understand the mechanics. "Stand still," he instructed. Baruch made a short, sharp click, pulled its front legs in, fixed all 8 eyes on him, and froze. Regulus extended his magic perception and followed the flow of its magic inward, mapping the Acromantula's structure in his mind. He lingered inside the weave and reached a conclusion. The Acromantula's magic was closed, coarse, and primitive. The circuits were narrow. Magic started from a core and circulated through the body, but by the time it returned, most of it had been lost. The utilization rate was low. It was a congenital, racial-level limitation, present in every Acromantula from birth. Congenital didn't mean immutable. Regulus thought of the disintegration curse. Its essence was returning matter to a malleable state, loosening formed structures so their units could be rearranged. Could the same principle be used in reverse here? Reopen a sealed magic system, put it into a reorganizable state, and then introduce new combinations during that window. But there were problems. He had used the disintegration curse before on organic beings for lethal ends. There was no need to control the process then. What he needed now was selective loosening, partial, non-lethal, so the structure wouldn't collapse while it was being guided to reorganize. That required precise control he wasn't yet confident he had. And even if he could loosen Baruch's magic, left to reorganize on its own, the magic would likely settle back into the same familiar pattern. Racial instinct would push it toward its original balance. To change direction, he needed an external influence. Natural magic came to mind. The forbidden forest was saturated with it. Magic in the soil, the air, the plants and rocks, an ambient, ownerless force. If, during the window when Baruch's magic was malleable, he could guide the forest's natural magic into its system, the spider's magic might incorporate that foreign element. If the reorganization succeeded, Baruch would retain its own reserves, but the circuits could be widened, efficiency increased, and crucially, it would gain a continuous channel to draw magic from the forbidden forest, raising its ceiling permanently. The idea was viable, but not tonight. He needed to determine how to reverse the disintegration curse on a living magic structure without killing it, how to set the loosened boundaries, how long the window would last, and how to introduce natural magic at the right moment. Without answers to those details, proceeding would be murder. He would return when he was ready. Baruch kept standing, all 8 eyes on him. Regulus met that gaze. "I have an idea, but I need to go back and prepare. I can't act now." The spider stretched a front leg forward, then pulled it back. "When?" "Soon." Regulus patted the leg. "Don't tell the others." The chelicerae opened and closed. "Won't tell." A pause, then a slight clicking of the chelicerae. "Father Aragog, should I tell him?" "Judge for yourself," Regulus said. Baruch made another short, sharp click and fell silent. Regulus stood. "I'm leaving." The spider escorted him to the edge of the depression and stopped at the bottom of the steep slope, its clicking slow and rhythmic, the sound sinking away. Regulus climbed out, glanced back, waved, and apparated away. Inside the nest, Mozag had already returned to the deepest tunnels. Layers of spider silk had sealed the passage behind her from ground to ceiling. Aragog lay in the center, its largest eyes narrowed to thin slits, a pearly white light seeping out. Baruch climbed down the slope, passed through the mist and the smaller spiders that scurried about, and approached Aragog. It lowered the front half of its body, pulled its legs in, closed its chelicerae, and assumed a crouching, submissive posture, instinctual deference to the leader. Aragog's slit of an eye flickered, otherwise it did not move. Baruch crawled past slowly until it vanished into the deep passageways. Aragog's eyes closed. Regulus landed in the pumpkin patch by Hagrid's hut. The principal's office lights were already out. Across the castle, only a few high tower windows reflected moonlight. He cast a flying charm and drifted up toward the tower. The moon had moved west, lower over the forbidden forest, its light dimmer and partly veiled by thicker clouds. When he flew over the black lake, the water was almost black, flashing briefly only when the wind stirred. Back in the dormitory, he washed quickly, drew the curtains, and lay down. With his eyes closed, his mind kept turning over the plan. Helping Baruch grow stronger had started as a spur-of-the-moment idea, but if it worked, the implications reached far beyond one spider. The method, using the disintegration curse in reverse to loosen a sealed magic structure, letting it incorporate external magic during reorganization and remolding it into something new, could be revolutionary. Most magical creatures were born with a single fixed magical manifestation. Dragons breathe fire and nothing else. Alchemies change size. Thunderbirds summon storms. A demigose's invisibility and foresight are extraordinary but still limited to those functions. Their magic is singular and pure, set by race. Wizards are different. A wizard's magic is raw, chaotic potential that becomes shaped into talents, transfiguration, charms, dark arts, alchemy, by training and choice. In theory, if you could reorganize a wizard's magic framework from the root, you could give them abilities they never had, change limits set at birth. But that's a far harder problem. A creature with singular magic, when reorganized, tends to reform in the same direction with additions. A wizard's magic, if broken down, could grow into anything. Who would set the direction? How would you prevent catastrophic instability afterwards? He couldn't answer those questions yet, so he would test the procedure on Baruch first, gather experience and data, and only then consider more ambitious applications. If it succeeded someday, background and bloodline might matter less. Knowing him, knowing the method, could be what mattered most. Regulus smiled faintly at the thought, then closed his eyes and slept. It was 8 o'clock on Sunday evening. The fourth-floor corridor was quiet. The torches were spaced far apart, throwing dim yellow light that left the stone walls half-lit and half-shadowed. The door to the abandoned classroom stood ajar. Regulus pushed it open and stepped inside. Desks and chairs were piled along both sides, leaving an open space in the center. The blackboard still held half-erased scrawls, too blurred to read. He waited in the middle of the room. The door opened, and Lily walked in. She wore her usual school robes tonight. No deliberate changes this time, unlike the last 2 meetings. The Gryffindor colors were bright against the drab walls. Her collar was turned out, a headband tied casually, and her red hair pulled into a ponytail. She moved with a lively, brisk energy, very much a spirited young Gryffindor. Regulus noticed a shadow in her expression, a look like someone trying to suppress an emotion. Her brows were slightly furrowed, but the corners of her mouth were lifted in a smile, as if she didn't want to show she was upset. He didn't pry. He greeted her in his usual calm voice. "Lily." She lifted her chin, pressed her lips together, took a deep breath, and when she exhaled, a smile was already in place. "Regulus." The trace of gloom vanished. Her gaze grew earnest and focused. This was their 3rd lesson. In the previous 2, Regulus had gone back over the basic spells from the start, making her run through them until she could feel the difference herself. The change had been obvious. Before, casting required her to force her will through her magic. She had to think hard, repeat the incantation in her head several times before her magic would obey. It felt like driving something stubborn forward, strained and unnatural. She had assumed that was simply how casting worked. Under Regulus's guidance, she learned to smooth the process. Now, with a single thought, her magical current flowed along familiar paths, and the spell flicked from the tip of her wand, clean and solid. The spells felt obedient. That sense of ease was something she had only felt before when brewing potions, so she prized the opportunity. Her stance, the way she held her wand, and the look in her eyes were all earnest. Beneath that earnestness, though, lay something else. A fear of wasting the chance, of not being good enough, of making Regulus bored with teaching. She couldn't name it precisely. She only knew she had to make this time count, that a friend's help wasn't free, and she should be worthy of it. Regulus swept her with a glance and, seeing her resolve, nodded with quiet approval. Lily was a talented young witch. Professor Slughorn had already praised her as a potions genius. His tutoring was useful but not decisive. These were basic spells, the sort anyone with ambition and practice could master. Practice in the ways a teacher and textbooks prescribed, then adjust little by little until the spell felt natural. Those with intuition would find their own best method. Others simply practiced until the magical path became familiar. For most students, that was enough. Basic spells covered many applications, and a competent wizard could live on them. But to go further, basic spells alone wouldn't do. That next step required something else. Lily had the talent and the intuition. What she lacked were the lessons no one usually taught. By helping her close the gap on the basics, Regulus could move on to more advanced work. She was in 3rd year, time to learn more profound magic. The Patronus charm, for example, was not merely another advanced spell. Even adult wizards found it difficult to summon a fully corporeal Patronus. Most could only produce a silvery mist, enough to repel a Dementor. Regulus considered the Patronus deeper than its practical use. It embodied a wizard's truest desires and core spirit, a bright region of the soul made manifest. A fully formed Patronus meant there was something in a wizard's heart sufficiently firm and pure to condense into the world. Mastering it was a form of self-knowledge and a threshold towards subtler magic. Regulus had already passed that door. He knew what crossing it meant. Those who did would advance to a level beyond mere accumulation of spells. Lily could learn the Patronus in time, but he intended to accelerate that process, not only to have her summon it, but to teach her his understanding of it. If he needed a reason, Lily was his friend, and he wanted her to be strong. War was not far off. Voldemort's forces were expanding. In a few years, conflict would sweep Britain, and no one could expect to stay untouched. People might choose sides or be dragged in, but there would be consequences either way. It was practical to want people to grow powerful now, and Lily, as a Muggle-born witch, would be particularly vulnerable to Voldemort's hatred. He pushed the thought aside. "No more remedial basics tonight," he said, voice relaxed. "Combat test. We'll duel." Lily blinked, then her eyes brightened. The light in them pushed away the earlier shadows. Her fingers tightened on her wand, the smile widening until her whole posture was animated. Regulus smiled back. "I'll go easy on you. Fight freely. I want to see how you use what you've learned in a real confrontation." Lily lifted her chin defiantly. "I don't need you to go easy on me." "All right," he said. He stepped back a few paces, creating distance, wand relaxed at his side. Lily inhaled and remembered his instruction. Predict your opponent's position. Don't hit where they are, hit where they're going to be. Simple in theory, hard in practice. She judged his stance, relaxed, weight shifted to the right. If she cast from the left, he should dodge right. Expelliarmus. A flash of red hurtled for Regulus's left. She had predicted he'd dodge right and aimed for the left, waiting for him to move into it. But he didn't dodge. The spell whistled half a foot past him, struck the wall, broke into a shower of red sparks and left a shallow gouge. Lily mouthed a curse inwardly. Why didn't he dodge? Regulus spoke calmly. "Your judgment was right, but it assumed I would dodge. Opponents don't always dodge. Sometimes it's easier to meet a spell head-on. Prepare a second spell at the same time. The first forces a reaction. The second hits whatever they choose." She listened, then nodded. He was right. She lifted her wand again and changed tactics, firing an Expelliarmus straight at his chest. Faster, more direct. Regulus still didn't dodge. The spell struck him and should have hit. Instead, it burst like silver mist across his body, a thin sheen that vanished. The spell dissipated harmlessly. Lily stared, mouth open. "What was that?" Regulus smiled without explaining. "You've improved. Your speed is faster and your force steadier, noticeably stronger than last week." Heat rose to the roots of Lily's ears. She didn't look away. Her green eyes met his, her smile involuntary. She forced herself to dampen it, raised her wand again, and decided to ask about it after the duel. For now, continue. Regulus knew her casting had tightened, her rhythm smoother, and her output more consistent. The remedial work had been effective, and her natural talent was cooperating. He raised his wand. They were about 5 meters apart. Regulus sent a stupefy with slowed speed and a clear trajectory, moderate power, so Lily had time to react. She responded quickly with a shield charm. The red bolt struck the barrier and deflected. Regulus followed with impedimenta, still deliberate. Lily dropped the shield charm and tried to dodge, but the spell was angled and clipped her shoulder. She stumbled back, frowned, and returned her wand to firing position. "You dropped your shield too early," Regulus observed. "You withdrew before the next spell arrived, and when you dodged, your intent was obvious. Your opponent can predict your landing point." "Understood," Lily said, nodding fiercely. She steadied her shield charm and held it. Regulus struck again. The barrier withstood it, and Lily stood solid inside. "Good," he approved. Lily snorted. "I know you're going easy on me." Regulus arched an eyebrow, but didn't contradict her. She looked at him, smiling. "But I did block that." "Yes, very good," he said earnestly. She scowled mockingly and settled back into stance. "Next, movement," Regulus announced, and began to walk, not fast, but rhythmic. Lily matched his steps. They circled the classroom, trading spells, and Lily began to understand movement wasn't just dodging. It was finding angles, creating openings, striking in the fraction of a second when he shifted his gesture. She let off a spell that cut in from the side. Regulus deflected it, but even so it was a tricky shot. "That one was good," he said, stopping for a moment to praise sincerely. "The timing was right. Cutting in forces an extra step to block. Keep that feeling, a bit faster, a bit more precise, and you could truly threaten me." The corners of Lily's mouth rose, her eyes sparkled. Regulus's next spell forced her back to focus, a shield charm, a quick step back, and she steadied herself. They continued, the classroom filling with light and the sound of magic, each exchange teaching her something new. Chapter 254. Why do some people just love to bully others? The two of them continued to circle, and Lily slowly found her rhythm. She was no longer just following Regulus. She began linking spells together to limit his movement. The first spell struck his right. the second cut off the space to his left, and the third launched the moment he changed direction. Regulus stepped back twice, blocked the 3 spells, and had to take a couple more strides to regain his balance. He stopped, looked at Lily, and pointed out those spells specifically. "The logic is sound," he said. "Use spells to press the opponent's path. Wait until they're forced to move in one direction, then strike that direction." This is an important part of dueling. It's not just 2 people firing at each other. It's about controlling the situation. The 3 spells you linked just now, that awareness is very good, a little faster with tighter connections, and I would really not have been able to get away. Lily listened earnestly, nodding now and then. Regulus went on. "Also, pay attention to the direction of the 16. Before someone casts a spell, the 16 will point toward the target in advance. That lead time is short, but it's enough for you to judge. Combined with the direction of their eyes, you can basically guess where the next spell will land." Halfway through his sentence, Lily blinked, mischievous. Her sing suddenly flicked, and an expelliarmus shot straight for his chest, exploiting the gap in his speech, clean and quick. Regulus raised an eyebrow, flicked his nin aside, and deflected the red light. It slammed into the wall. The movement was a little theatrical. A hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he glanced at her. Lily was a bit breathless. A few strands of hair mussed. She stood there, eyes bright, waiting for his verdict. She knew it had been a good shot, nearly hit him. Though she also knew Regulus hadn't been fighting seriously, she felt exhilarated. Regulus's tone was gentle, his expression that of someone watching a mischievous child. Attacking while someone is speaking isn't exactly honorable. Seeing that look, Lily straightened indignantly. "You said it yourself. There's no honor in dueling." Regulus considered it for a second. He didn't recall saying that, but after looking at her, he decided to accept it. I did say that." Lily hummed, a little smug and slightly embarrassed, though she couldn't entirely hide her grin. They sparred a while longer. Regulus let her lead the offense while he retreated and parried. He pushed back occasionally to keep up the pressure, but never so much that she couldn't cope. The rhythm suited her. She handled movement, spell angles, and tempo more and more smoothly. She was still far from a true duel capable, but her progress was good for a third-year witch. By 9:30, Regulus sheathed his 16, and Lily stopped as well. She leaned against the windowsill, taking a gulp of water, breathing hard. Regulus stood in the center of the classroom, waiting for her to recover. Outside, it was completely dark. The moon hung high, and a thin mist had formed on the glass. Lily finished her water, put the bottle away, and finally asked the question she'd been holding back. She pointed at her own chest and made a blocking gesture. "That thing on you, what is that?" "Constant shield charm," Regulus replied. "It's always on. You don't cast it each time." Lily's brow furrowed in surprise. "Always on?" "With sufficient 14 and familiarity with the spell, you can make it permanent," Regulus said. "But the root is 14 control. Without casting, without using a 6 time, you make the 14 do it directly." What he said was true, but not the whole truth. His constant shield charm wasn't the same one he'd found in the restricted section months ago. After Levin was awakened, the imagery of the Patronus had merged with it, and it had evolved from a defensive spell into something else. Passive, constant, almost instinctive. It had grown out of long-term fort shaping and the internalization of a guardian will. It wasn't profound, but it was advanced. There was no need to tell Lily that. Without Levin, the Patronus imagery, the constant shield charm alone was still impressive, just incredibly difficult. You had to compress a spell into a thin film, weave it through 14, bind it to your body, continuously supply fort, and let it sustain itself. The training required such fine 14 control that even many adult wizards couldn't manage it. Difficulty, however, wasn't a reason not to practice. Even if you couldn't reach perfection, the practice itself taught you perception of control, distribution, and continuous output, all foundations for advancement. Lily's brow tightened. She remembered the scene from last weekend when Regulus had caught her spell in his hand and crushed it. He'd told her then that 14 control was the foundation. She inhaled, looked up at him with earnest eyes. "Then how do I practice that?" "Slowly. Regulus said softly. This is what I'll teach you next. Lily nodded and blinked. What about combat practice? Should we keep doing that? For combat, find others, classmates, friends. Use the spells you've learned more often, spar, and you'll naturally get faster. You can come to me too. He paused. But next, I want you to practice something else. Lily raised an eyebrow. What? Patronus charm. Lily blinked, uncertainty in her voice. A Patronus? The one even adult wizards find so hard to summon? Regulus nodded. Yes. She looked at him, hesitated a moment, and asked directly, why practice this now? The Patronus turns emotion into 14 power, Regulus said calmly. Practicing it is actually practicing something else. He added, you'll find it useful in the future. Lily mulled that over. Practicing the Patronus wasn't really about practicing the Patronus. She didn't entirely understand, but she didn't press further. For over a year, everything Regulus had told her had its own reason. If she didn't grasp it immediately, she'd learn later. Regulus's expression grew a little more serious. There's one thing you need to understand, he said. Lily looked up. For Patronus practice, you can practice on your own, and it doesn't matter if your friends know, but you cannot say you learned it from me. Lily paused and studied his face. She didn't ask why. She could tell he was serious. Okay, she said, nodding hard. I'll remember. After a beat, she brightened with a thought. Then can I ask Professor McGonagall, tell her I want to learn, and ask her to give me direction? That way, there's a source for it. Regulus looked at her with approval and nodded. Lily lifted her chin, proud. The smugness almost spilled across her features. Regulus smiled and praised her. Smart. He walked to the corner of the classroom, tapped a piece of broken wood with his fingers, and the fragment transformed into a long, slender feather that floated up. He placed it in his palm and handed it to Lily. Take it. She took it, peering at the feather and then at him. Hold your 16, but don't cast a spell. Don't wave the 16, he instructed. Sense the 14 in your body. Let it move to your fingertips, gather there, and then let it out from your fingertips to touch the feather. Lily lowered her head and stared at the feather, brows knit. She didn't know where to begin. After a moment, she looked up, frustrated. I can't sense where the 14 is. Regulus asked patiently, when you cast a spell, where does the 14 come from? Lily thought, from, inside my body. Right, Regulus nodded. Close your eyes and go through your most familiar spell in your mind, without saying it. Feel where the 14 starts to move, where it goes, and what it feels like in your body before it gathers at the tip of the 16. Lily closed her eyes, holding her 16. Her lips moved as if whispering the spell, then stopped. Half a minute later, she opened her eyes. I have a bit of a feeling. From here, she pointed slightly left of her chest. It goes to my arm, then to the tip of the 16. Remember that feeling. Now don't cast. Just guide the 14 to your fingertips, stop it there, and then let it out to touch the feather. Lily took a deep breath and looked at the feather again. Nothing happened. She tried again. Still nothing. She pursed her lips, concentrating. The third time, the edge of the feather gave a faint twitch, as if a breeze had brushed it, then stilled. Lily's eyes widened. She looked at Regulus. Bright, he said softly. It moved, but it's not stable enough. Continue. Let it float up completely. Lily tried again. This time, the feather rose from her palm, trembling and leaning to one side. She adjusted hastily. The feather wobbled and then fell. She picked it up and tried again. The fifth attempt held. The feather hovered steadily about an inch above her palm, motionless. Lily stared, holding her breath, afraid a single movement would send it down. Regulus, calm as ever, said, Now make it draw a circle. Lily's mouth twitched. Were you serious? Regulus was. She concentrated, and the feather tilted to the right, then shot to the left, describing a crooked arc and dropping again. Regulus simply said, Try again. She tried repeatedly. Making the feather complete a circle remained elusive. Regulus tapped a broken brick in the corner. It became a cup. He set the cup on the windowsill and tapped its rim. Aguamenti poured from his fingertips, filling the cup to 80%. Leave the feather for now. Look at this, he said. Make ripples appear on the water's surface and control the shape of the ripples. Lily walked over and peered into the cup. Is this training method specifically designed to show you how bad you are? She asked, half amused. Regulus smiled. Pretty much. Lily laughed, then focused on the water. The first attempt produced no movement. The second made fine ripples that quickly vanished. The third produced steadier ripples, but the shape was uncontrolled, radiating in all directions. Lily frowned and tried to gather it into a square, but the surface simply became a mess. "The fortine is too scattered," Regulus observed. "The fortine you send needs to be concentrated. Start from a point, and you decide where it expands." Lily nodded and tried again. This time a thin, steady ripple formed, a shallow line, but precise and controlled. She stared at it and felt her lips curl. Regulus said nothing. He waited for her to understand. A gust slapped the window and the ripple dissipated. Lily let out a soft breath. "It's almost 10, Regulus said gently. "That's enough for today." Lily pushed the cup aside and clapped her hands together. "Magic control. Practice on my own when I go back?" "Yes," Regulus said. "Both the feather and the water work. Take your time." She nodded, then hesitated. Her eyes flicked to his face, cautious, as if weighing whether to ask. Finally she spoke, voice a little tight. "You say, why do some people just love to bully others?" The small hurt she'd been holding in since she arrived resurfaced in her eyes. Regulus raised an eyebrow. A few days ago, when Snape had come to him, the look on Snape's face, combined with the cautious expression Lily now wore. If Sirius is involved, there must inevitably be James Potter. Chapter 255. Lily, go teach Sirius a lesson for me. At Hogwarts, James and Sirius's bullying of Snape had almost become a regular program, complete with a fixed audience. It wasn't an occasional spat or the sort of squabble common among schoolboys. It couldn't be dismissed as mere youthful folly. It was sustained, deliberate harassment carried out with a sense of superiority. There was no justification for it. It was bullying, plain and simple, and it was malicious. James's only real reason was that Snape existed. He despised Snape's background, his manner, and his interest in the dark arts. James wrapped his cruelty in a veneer of righteousness, bragging that he would be a Death Eater someday, and that Snape dabbled in unacceptable magic. But beneath that thin shell, it was simpler. He liked tormenting Snape. He liked the dominance, the thrill of showing off in front of his friends. The moralizing came later. The malice came first. Snape had struck back at times, but rarely. Most of the time, James initiated the provocation. The Marauders insulted him with names like Snivelus, used the Marauders' map to track him, and picked him off when he was alone. The Shrieking Shack incident was a particularly cruel setup. Sirius tricked Snape into seeing Lupin in werewolf form during a full moon. James eventually intervened, but only because he feared his friend would be expelled, not out of kindness. When Lily arrived and called James an arrogant bully, he threatened her, saying he'd only leave Snape alone if she agreed to go out with him. In humiliation and fury, Snape spat the worst thing he could think of at Lily. "I don't need help from a filthy little mudblood like you." After that, Lily cut him off. Later, after graduation, Snape did join Voldemort's side and betrayed the prophecy to him. He knew the prophecy pointed to the Potter family, but only stopped when Voldemort intended to kill Lily. James, on the other hand, grew into an entirely different man, no longer arrogant, no longer a bully, a responsible husband and father. When Voldemort came for them, James threw himself in front of Lily and Harry, even without his wand, telling them to run, and was killed by the killing curse. That, however, was the future. Right now, with Regulus's presence changing things, the future felt uncertain. At least in their school days, James was the primary aggressor and Snape the long-term victim. But Regulus didn't care about arguments over who was right or wrong. Who bullied whom was irrelevant to him. What mattered was power, who had it, who could use it, and who couldn't. That was the underlying logic, not morality. Why could James keep doing it? Because he had power, and no one around could stop him. Why could Snape only take the abuse? Because, despite the dangerous appeal of the dark arts he studied, Snape understood the limits of his situation. He wanted recognition and to show his talent, but he couldn't use that power openly. He cared what people thought, so he restrained himself. That choice and that limitation left him vulnerable. Ultimately, it wasn't a question of right or wrong. It was a question of circumstances and force. Regulus wouldn't preach a moral lesson to Lily about that. She didn't want a lecture. She wanted direction, what to do. Regulus glanced at Lily. She looked troubled, brows drawn, lips pressed together, as if waiting for him to give her an answer. She'd started coming to him not only with questions about magic, but with the small, messy troubles of life, too. She seemed to think he had an answer for everything, and believed him when he spoke. How that habit formed, he wasn't sure. He only knew he didn't mind it. Lily's question, as always, was shaped by a moral lens. Who was to blame, who deserved sympathy, and whether James and Sirius had any excuse. Regulus saw it differently. He saw only power and its distribution. He didn't say that to her. Instead, he asked a simple, practical question. "Do you want to be able to stop this yourself the next time it happens?" he asked. Her face changed as if a light had been lit in her chest. Then, uncertainty clouded it again. She lowered her gaze, fidgeted with the edge of her robe, and thought of all the times she'd spoken up but done nothing more. She wasn't timid. She wasn't afraid of trouble. She just knew she couldn't win against 4 boys with the advantage of numbers. That helplessness had come to her more than once. Regulus listened patiently, as he always did, never annoyed, never impatient. When she finished, he asked quietly, "Afraid you don't have enough power?" She gave a soft, and he smiled ever so slightly. "Isn't that what I'm teaching you?" Lily looked up at him. He left the question hanging in the air. "Practice a bit more. How could you not stand up to a few of them?" She blushed, the corners of her mouth twitching, and clutched her robe. "Do you believe in yourself?" he asked. And then, "Do you believe in me?" This time, her hesitation melted away. Her green eyes shone cleanly. "I do," she said, quick and steady, as if afraid that hesitation would make it less true. Regulus nodded, satisfied. She faltered for a moment, then added, "But Sirius is there." She said his name awkwardly. She usually called him that Black from Gryffindor, and her voice never suited the surname. Now there were 2 Blacks to worry about, and the old habit felt strange. Regulus's tone didn't change. "I know." "Oh, so you still," she began. He hesitated, a rare crease of worry crossing his brow. "He wastes his days and doesn't apply himself properly," he said. "I'm a Slytherin. It's not convenient for me to manage him. Could you help me teach him a lesson?" Lily stared at him, incredulous, searching his face to see if he was serious. He looked back at her with a hint of helplessness that made his request earnest. She thought for a moment, then laughed, a clear, bright sound, puffed out her chest, and said crisply, "No problem. Leave it to me." Regulus laughed too. "Not yet," he said. "Wait until you've practiced more. It's still early." She pouted, unconvinced but not arguing. She knew he was right. "Next time we'll practice the Patronus," he continued. "You can practice wandless control on your own when you go back. Feathers and water will both work. Take your time." Lily's whole face brightened. She answered with an enthusiastic, eyes shining, much lighter than when she'd arrived. The 2 left the abandoned classroom together. The corridor was quiet, torches casting shadows on the stone walls. Lily walked toward Gryffindor Tower, and after 2 steps turned to wave, "See you next time." Regulus walked the other way. Sirius had practiced over the holidays. His progress was visible, but from Regulus's perspective, it was still insufficient. Worse, Sirius hadn't sustained the effort. At school, he went back to fooling around and bullying others. It angered Regulus. Talent squandered. The more Sirius played now, the more he would regret it when the time came. Once the war began, those without power wouldn't even have the luxury of regret. Regulus wanted to find a way to motivate him. If Lily could be trained enough to stand up for herself and others, perhaps she could also give Sirius the kick he needed. Being taught a lesson by Lily, by a Muggle-born witch he looked down on, should be humiliating enough to spur him into action. Better than any beating from Regulus would be the sting of seeing others progress while he stood still. And what about Snape? With his prickly, proud nature, being rescued by Lily or forced to stand by quietly while she intervened would be excruciating. The internal battle between "I don't need your help" and "thank you" would twist him into silence, and he'd walk away brooding. James, arrogant and used to looking down on Muggleborns, being put in his place by one. Now that would be priceless. It would be something James could never quite figure out. Regulus smiled slightly to himself and continued on. This was a thing worth looking forward to. Chapter 256. The last Wednesday of November, breakfast hour. Cold winds howled across the Scottish Highlands, but the protective wards around the castle kept them at bay. The ceiling of the great hall reflected the sky outside, gloomy, thick clouds parting only occasionally to let a sliver of sunlight through before closing up again. Inside, the hall was warm and toasty. Long tables sagged under plates of bacon, scrambled eggs, toast, and steaming bowls of oatmeal. The air was thick with the scent of butter and jam. Young students chattered and laughed. At the Gryffindor table, someone was lunging for bacon. Hufflepuffs were arguing about the weekend Quidditch match. Ravenclaws huddled in small groups, whispering. Flocks of owls beat their wings through the high windows, letters and parcels falling like rain. A gray-brown eagle owl landed in front of Regulus, clutching a folded scrap of parchment in its talons. There was no seal, no signature, just a piece of paper folded twice. The owl extended a claw and nudged it toward his hand. Regulus took it and unfolded it. Regulus, the words I spoke to you during the holiday, you still remember. You didn't listen. This is the second time. There won't be a third. Bellatrix Lestrange. The handwriting was forceful, the strokes pressing into the paper. The turns were almost violent, the last characters scrawled in a rush, as if the writer had lost control of their temper. Regulus set the letter down and stared at it without expression for a long moment. He remembered the first time he'd gotten a letter like this, his first year at Hogwarts. He had only just arrived. His magical development was in its infancy, and what he could conjure then was pitiful. Aside from the basic manipulations of magical flow he'd taught himself as a child and a handful of standard spells, there wasn't much to see. He had always believed in his talent. Once he learned something, he mastered it. But back then, there was nothing worth boasting about. No star orbit meditation, no Patronus, no disintegration curse, no fiend fire, no space magic, no light source craft. He was simply weak. When that first letter arrived, he remembered feeling irritated and a little squeezed by pressure. Not because of Bellatrix herself. Her talent in the dark arts and her House of Black lineage could not intimidate him, but because the letter was an extension of Lord Voldemort's attention. Bellatrix was his mouthpiece. Her temper was a thread tied to that side. Accepting the letter meant moving forward. Ignoring it meant a question of attitude. Back then, Regulus had thought that if he kept his head down for a few years, beating Bellatrix later would be no problem. Even that was conservative compared to what he'd become in a year. Over the past year, he had progressed too fast. His Patronus, the starry sky kite, could carry him through space and directly breach multiple defenses in the House of Black. Even Orion had been shocked. The disintegration curse. From studying the magical structure of a mandrake, he'd spent 9 days and nights deducing it and finally built a complete model in his mind. One form was precision lethality, the other, a wide-range infrasound assault. It was a spell of his own invention, something that hadn't existed before. Fiendfire, once only summonable with an emotional anchor, he had tamed into obedience, controllable in shape and temperature, even fashioned into a flying device approaching the speed of sound. Space magic, which had begun with Space Leap, had developed into Space Anchor, spell warping, and now the spatial network and spatial transfiguration. Natural magic he'd found in a greenhouse in Cornwall. Light source magic was still being pushed forward, but its underlying logic had been verified as feasible. His foundation, star orbit meditation, regal lit, Sirius dimmed, had allowed him to perceive his soul. Those conjectures were turning into real power, piece by piece. Compared to the boy who had arrived at Hogwarts a year ago, it was a different league. But Bellatrix did not know this. She only knew his conduct at school, what happened in classrooms, hallways, and the common room. She might have guessed the influence of dark enlightenment or other rumors, but in her eyes he was still just a child, 12 years old, and a child is a child. Regulus thought about who might know everything he had done. Dumbledore knew part: space magic, natural magic, fiendfire, the Patronus, the soul-seeing. He probably did not know the disintegration curse or light source magic. Regulus had never shown those in school. Orion knew another part, but not the breakthroughs after Regal lit up, nor the manifestation of the soul, nor the spatial network. No one knew the whole picture. Pieces were known to different people, but none could put together the complete map. A single other person did come to mind: Grindelwald. The old man, with his plans and foresight, had sent Regulus into the sleeping sea abyss and had been involved in the whole Regal lighting. Freya was his agent. That maritime dossier had come from him. The whole thing had been a stage he constructed from start to finish. Perhaps he even knew how far Regulus's progress had gone. Regulus suppressed the thought with a small twitch of his mouth. Why dwell on it? Bad luck followed such musings. He looked back down at Bellatrix's letter. Its arrival was actually perfectly timed, more convenient than he'd expected. If Bellatrix hadn't seen what he was doing, he'd have had to make a show of it to force her to notice. Now she had delivered herself to his doorstep, sparing him the effort. He raised a finger, intending to burn the parchment, then paused. He glanced up and saw the gray-brown eagle owl mid-flap at the table edge, not yet out the high window. With a thought, he reached out through the magical flow and pulled the bird back. The owl flipped in the air, wings beating wildly, losing a few feathers as it was dragged backward. It gave a panicked cry, talons grasping for purchase, and stumbled against the table, claws snagging the cloth. 2 more feathers drifted down. Regulus ignored the creature and reached for the fries on his plate. The moment his fingers touched them, the fries warped, elongating, narrowing, the tips sharpening into a quill. He pinched its shaft and dipped it into the ketchup. The ketchup itself changed under the nib, from dark red to ink black, from thick paste to thin, pooling like ink at the bottom of the plate. Beside it, the unchanged ketchup remained red. The boundary between them was clean. Heads turned. At the Slytherin table, some older students exchanged glances. Regulus spread the paper open and wrote a reply directly over Bellatrix's scrawl. 1 word. So. The handwriting was flamboyant. The S took a full line of the space, the final flick curving sharply upward like a blade. He folded the letter and handed it back to the owl. Go back where you came from. As he said it, a strand of magic seeped from his fingertips and clung to the owl's feathers. The bird stilled. The panic in its eyes receded, though a faint grievance lingered. It lowered its head, pecked hard at the back of Regulus's hand, seized the letter, spread its wings, and took off. Avery, sitting close by, had glimpsed the reply. Regulus hadn't bothered to hide it. Avery made no sound. He just looked at him as if to ask what was going on. Regulus only shook his head a little. Avery shrugged and returned to his breakfast. If Regulus didn't want to say, he wouldn't pry. Regulus kept eating. Everything was going according to plan. Bellatrix would draw a clear line. No one dared touch those he openly protected. It worked easily at Hogwarts. No one would risk crossing someone he plainly shielded. Some schemes might still appear, but a little attention from him made them harmless. The real problem was outside the school. He didn't underestimate Bellatrix's ferocity, nor did he overestimate her strength. He wanted Costa and Vance established in Slytherin, even given prospects after graduation. They couldn't be targeted. Using Bellatrix to make an explicit statement during the holidays was perfect. It made the protection public, enforced by a voice people would hear. Bellatrix, as loud and useful as she was, could pass on his influence. Letting Costa and Vance suffer a little was nothing to him. He had endured Crucio. A little loss or pain in exchange for clear protection and strategic benefit was a bargain many wouldn't have had the chance to make. He would give them protection and they would act for him. He took the risk. They accepted it. No one owed anyone anything. Now it was only Rabistan left. Best to deal with everything at once. He wasn't rushing Alex and the others. He let them find their own rhythm and handle matters steadily. Classes passed as normal. After the afternoon defense against the dark arts lesson, the corridors emptied out. Regulus let Avery and the others go back first, then walked in the opposite direction, up the stairs to Professor McGonagall's office. Spatial transfiguration had progressed. He'd been practicing nearly 3 months since term began. The duration of his transformations had stretched from a few seconds to nearly a minute. Structures were clearer now, not the vague distortions of the start. Squares were square, circles were circle. Even if the edges were still a little irregular, forms were recognizable. He knocked. "Come in." McGonagall's voice from inside. He pushed the door and entered. Professor McGonagall sat behind her desk. Opposite her sat another person, Sirius. Chapter 257. The Black Brothers. Regulus raised an eyebrow, looking mildly surprised. Subconsciously, he had assumed Sirius had done something wrong, been caught by Professor McGonagall, and was now being scolded. He examined Sirius, his posture, his expression, where his hands were, trying to see if he showed any obvious signs of nervousness, defensiveness, or the dejection one might expect after a reprimand. But Sirius hadn't come to be chastised. He'd actually been coming to see Professor McGonagall a lot lately. After Transfiguration class, McGonagall had kept him behind, told him he had a gift for morphological intuition, and given him a copy of Advanced Transfiguration, The Limits of Form. Sirius had gone home and studied it properly. The more he read, the more fascinated he became. When something puzzled him, he'd bring it back to McGonagall, then practice it until he'd mastered it, then return with new questions. It had become his routine. James and Lupin had both noticed that Sirius had changed. He'd grown quieter, and Sirius himself couldn't explain it. Once he opened that book, curiosity took hold. He wanted to practice and to understand, so he did. Where before he would listen in class and leave, now he sought out McGonagall, asking deeper, more probing questions. Transfiguration itself hadn't become harder. He'd simply begun digging deeper. The effort was a complete turnaround from his old, take-it-or-leave-it attitude. When Sirius saw Regulus come in, his face shifted and his body stiffened. He stared at him, and a ridiculous feeling rose up, the sense of someone secretly working hard behind the scenes who's suddenly caught by the one person they least want to see. He knew the gap between him and Regulus was huge, but having been recognized by Professor McGonagall sparked a competitive streak. Not that he wanted to compete with Regulus specifically, but he didn't want to fall too far behind. So he'd been quietly practicing Transfiguration harder than anyone else. And yet he'd been seen while practicing. A strange mix of guilt, panic, and embarrassment welled up. He sat a little straighter, withdrew his hands from the desk to rest on his knees, glanced aside, then returned his gaze to the parchment, pretending to read. In truth, he had taken nothing in. His face tried to look indifferent, but failed, an awkward, caught expression. Regulus took him in and thought he'd been right. The look on Sirius's face, the restlessness. This boy must have done something, been caught by the professor, and now felt guilty. He looked at McGonagall. She sat behind her desk, quill in hand, with half-finished annotations on the parchment before her. Sirius had always been troublesome at Grimmauld Place and at school. As a family member, Regulus felt he should say something. He stepped forward and inclined his head politely toward McGonagall. "Professor, excuse the interruption. I have a few questions about spatial transfiguration I would like to ask. If now is not a good time, I can come back later." Then he turned to Sirius with a gentle expression, something like a senior's patience toward a junior, and a hint of apology. "Sorry, Professor. Sirius has been giving you trouble." McGonagall looked up at Regulus with an unreadable expression. Her gaze flicked from his face to Sirius's and back again. The corners of her mouth twitched as if to smile, then she composed herself, pushing up her glasses and clearing her throat. In her eyes something passed, and although she said nothing immediately, she finally spoke. Sirius sprang up, his face flushing crimson, half anger, half mortification. He wanted to snap back, to demand what Regulus meant, but Regulus's serious look left him at a loss. He glared at Regulus, then at McGonagall. Her barely concealed amusement made him angrier. He took a breath and tried to steady himself, but the anger wouldn't go. Regulus watched him with that same steady calm and thought, "This boy still has a temper." McGonagall gave a light cough. The stern Gryffindor head of house, usually all severity, had amusement in her eyes now. She sat upright, robes unruffled, expression still rigorous, though the lines at the corners of her eyes betrayed her. "Mr. Black," she said, looking from Sirius to Regulus, "Sirius has not made any mistakes." She paused, as if the statement weren't quite complete, then fixed Sirius with a stern look and added, "At least not this time." Sirius froze, eyes wide, staring at Regulus as though to say, "Did you hear that?" Regulus regarded Sirius with a flicker of surprise and then inclined his head to McGonagall. "Thank you, Professor." He sat down next to Sirius. The two boys were side by side, facing McGonagall, one sitting upright and composed, the other twitching as if ready to spring. McGonagall observed them in her mind. Sirius's magical energy surged and fluctuated like a pot of boiling water. His emotions and his magic were one and the same. When he was happy, his magic leapt. When he was angry, it rose. Regulus's magical energy was calm and steady, like a quietly flowing river with no ripples on the surface. They shared a name in blood, yet presented almost opposite temperaments. Emotional stability was not always good. Sometimes it meant detachment, a habit of hiding oneself too early. But in terms of magic, the control and endurance that stability brought was a real advantage. Many witches and wizards with talent spent their lives battling their emotions. Only by mastering that struggle could they reliably use their power. Sirius's bursts could be astonishing, but they were inconsistent and required time and training to harness into something summoned at will. She'd seen Sirius's progress and was pleased. His morphological intuition was genuine. It would serve him well if he could be a bit better behaved. The after-class pranks and corridor scrapes were a separate matter. And Regulus, his understanding of transfiguration already exceeded the classroom. The questions he asked made McGonagall pause to think before answering, and she couldn't be sure how far he'd truly gone. What he showed her was only what he chose to show. Someone capable of taming fiendfire to that degree couldn't possibly be entirely straightforward. The things he didn't reveal, the things he couldn't show the professor, were likely his real strengths. But that wasn't necessarily bad. Everyone who delved deeply had aspects they preferred to keep private. Both brothers had talent, and their personalities were distinct. Sirius was simple to read, reckless, impulsive, quick to offend without meaning to. His heart wasn't bad. He hated injustice and despised bullies, but sometimes he misjudged who was being wronged. Regulus, McGonagall thought, was harder to pin down. What he did didn't fit neatly under justice. Albus had told her Regulus had a Patronus capable of traversing space, a kind of light in his heart, and she trusted Albus's judgment. She pushed that thought down, collected herself, looked at Sirius, and raised her hand. "Begin, Mr. Black." Sirius was still glaring at Regulus, his chest full of a restless energy that might have been anger or something like pride. The way Regulus had interceded earlier made him feel ridiculous, as if he were the child being defended by that younger, more composed brother. He didn't want to lose face in front of Regulus. He hadn't wasted these past months. His transfiguration had improved. McGonagall herself had praised it, and he wanted to show that. He wouldn't admit care for Regulus's opinion, but he did want Regulus to see that he'd improved. He remembered what Regulus had said over the holidays. He'd found his talent in transfiguration. He was truly good at it now. He wasn't the same boy who'd been knocked down by Regulus at Grimmauld Place. He took a deep breath and drew his wand. Chapter 258. Regulus is quite presentable. Regulus noticed Sirius's magic, which had been churning wildly a moment before, suddenly calm and condense in a single direction. Not bad, he thought. This boy hadn't just been goofing around. He'd actually been practicing. Sirius pointed his wand at the eraser on the desk. The eraser began to transfigure. Changes radiated from the center outward, its gray-white color turning brown, edges pulling in, and 4 little legs pushing out from the bottom as a tail unfurled. A fluffy squirrel crouched on the desk, tail up, front paws lifted. It blinked black eyes and cocked its head to look at them. It hopped down, ran 2 steps, and stopped. Sirius tapped his wand again. The squirrel elongated, wings sprouted from its back, and it became a bird. A starling, feathers grayish-white, circled the office once, returned to the desk, and chirped twice. Another tap, and the starling rounded, its ears lengthening into a rabbit's form. A white rabbit with red eyes and perky ears hopped twice on the desk. Tap! The rabbit flattened, limbs withdrew, and its back arched into a tortoise. A dark green shell appeared, and the head poked out as it crawled forward slowly. Sirius glanced at the tortoise, pointed his wand casually, and a section of the desk sank into a shallow pool. A matchstick floated from the corner, hovered above the water, and began to transfigure. Its head melted, and the wood softened into water, which flowed into the pool and perfectly covered the bottom. The tortoise moved in the water, awkwardly. Another tap, and a fish leaped from the surface, not the tortoise transforming again, but the water from the matchstick shaped into a fish. Silvery white scales flashed as it swam 2 laps, slapped its tail, and splashed a few drops. Regulus watched all of it and gave a small, satisfied nod. He meant it. He genuinely thought the work was good. It wasn't the changing forms that impressed him so much as the magic itself. Sirius's magic moved smoothly and fluidly through the transfigurations, entering the targets in a different way from most young students. Most students transfigure by pushing from the outside in, forcing a thing into a predetermined shape. The longer you pressed, the harder it became, and the result was blunt and imprecise. Sirius worked from the inside out, letting the new form grow naturally. The end result might look similar, but the understanding behind it was fundamentally different. He wasn't merely forcing a change. He knew what the thing should be. Sirius stole a look at Regulus for a reaction and found him nodding, approval plain on his face. The corners of Sirius's mouth twitched upward before he forced them down. He realized, with a self-directed curse, that he was pleased because Regulus was pleased. He cut the thought off, turned his gaze away, and watched Professor McGonagall, whose eyes also held approval. Sirius flicked his wand. The fish shot up, hung in midair, and began to change. Its body widened, limbs sprouted from its belly, its head grew, and a mane flared down its neck. A lion landed on the desk, paws on the surface, mane thick and heavy. It thumped a front paw down, producing a low vibration, yawned to reveal white teeth, padded 2 steps, and flicked its tail. Another wave of the wand, and the top sheet from a nearby stack of parchment folded and stretched midair. The edges thickened, the paper darkened to brown, and fur sprouted. Its head lengthened, and antlers burst from its crown. A stag touched down beside the lion, slightly smaller, with long, slender legs and branched antlers. It tilted its head at the lion with a curious, questioning look. Sirius considered, tapped his wand again, and the cushion from an empty chair floated up and tumbled as it transfigured. The cotton redistributed, the frame shrank, and fabric became fur. A large dog landed on the floor, bigger than an ordinary hound, dark gray, sturdy legs, semi-drooping ears, who gave one wag of its tail, ran to the lion, sniffed it, and then circled the stag. The 3 animals began to move through McGonagall's office. The lion strode toward the stag sidestepped, and the dog sprang between them, only to be gently swatted by the lion and sent to roll, then scramble up and continue circling. The stag lowered its head, nudged the dog rolled, and resumed. Regulus lingered on the dog, and the stag a little longer than on the lion. Gryffindors loved lions. Of course, there was nothing to say about that. But seeing a stag and a large dog together tugged something familiar in him, and he drew his eyes away. Sirius's transfigurations were flawless in form and motion. But Regulus wasn't watching merely the shapes. He watched the flow of magic through each transformation, smooth, purposeful, directed from beginning to end. The intent was always clear. It showed that Sirius's understanding of transfiguration was deepening. For a third-year student, that kind of progress was impressive. It should not stop here. Now that the talent had been identified, it needed to be pushed, practiced, made firm. Regulus thought of Lily and the things he'd said to her. If she truly learned this, and one day ran into Sirius bullying someone in a corridor, Sirius, egged on by James Potter and his gang, spent his time in mischief, cornering Snape and wasting hours on nonsense. Yet here he was, practicing transfiguration seriously under Professor McGonagall. He wasn't incapable of improvement, he just needed direction or the right stimulus. Regulus smirked inwardly at the thought of giving him that stimulation. He also knew he couldn't be the one to do it anymore. A few beatings might provoke rebellion. Being bested by someone he'd taught would be more instructive. Sirius kept glancing at him, that smug smile popping up and being forced down again. He wanted Regulus to see his progress, but not to know he cared about Regulus's opinion. The expression on his face became oddly tangled. Regulus read it, roughly understood, and nodded with approval. "Not bad," he said. "Progress is obvious. Keep practicing." Sirius's smile grew a little, then he forced it down, turning his head to watch the animals. The dog chased the lion's tail, while the stag stood placidly to one side, occasionally looking down before returning to indifference. Professor McGonagall was pleased with Sirius, but her attention was more drawn to the interaction between the 2 brothers. She had asked Regulus to stay and watch, but she had worried he might dismiss Sirius's work out of hand. She knew Regulus's level. He had already touched the threshold of spatial transfiguration and had said, on the way in, that he had questions about it. Spatial transfiguration was technically still transfiguration of form, but it was far harder than changing a material body. One dealt with space itself, the other with an object's physical structure. The gap between them wasn't merely a matter of difficulty, it was a difference of dimension. Regulus could already transfigure space. Sirius was still working with ordinary matter. McGonagall worried a casual remark from Regulus might wipe out the confidence Sirius had built. But she had invited Regulus to stay, so she couldn't reproach herself for it. Her worry proved unnecessary. The brothers' relationship was better than she feared. Watching them gave McGonagall another layer of understanding about Regulus. Highly gifted, yes, but also decent. She had told Sirius that changing essence was no better than changing form, merely a different direction of study. It had been comforting words, because someone who could change the essence of matter would naturally command changing form as well. Form was the foundation. Only a solid foundation allowed higher levels to stand upon it. Changing form could be profound in its own right, turning solids into liquids, liquids into gases, but Regulus's focus was already on something beyond that. Compared to McGonagall or Dumbledore, he still had far to go, but that was an unfair comparison. Among students, his level was exceptional. A second year reaching this stage in Transfiguration was something she had never before seen. Sirius fidgeted in his seat when he finished his last Transfiguration, as if wanting to say something and holding himself back. Regulus sat calm and steady beside him, still watching the animals, the satisfaction on his face genuine, an acknowledgement of Sirius's progress and ambition. McGonagall cleared her thoughts and addressed Regulus directly. "Mr. Black, your question?"